Hello and welcome everybody to the first stream I've done since relocating away from hell. So, tonight we'll be looking at about 73 Xbox 360 games. And unfortunately, I'd planned to do 75, but for whatever reason I messed that up. Partly it's because I was a little busy, couldn't really get through all the games I thought I might be able to get through. Then we had some other live streams that cropped up in late July, early August, and I was in the middle of a move. So between all of those factors, I didn't end up getting to do the tier list I'd intended to do. And so I decided to make up for lost time and try to cover this. And the reason I wanted to do it late last month is because the Xbox store for Xbox 360 just closed. And so I wanted to honor this console before it officially became a part of history. But that didn't end up happening. A bunch of other people did stuff like that, so I figured it wasn't too important that I do it at the time, but it's still pretty fresh, so I don't think that the obituary is out of place. Now, one thing to keep in mind is my microphone just went through a move, so let me know if anything sounds weird or unusual. So keep me posted about that, because I don't really know if any of the dials were moved when I was moving this thing, because it's on a mic arm now, so it's a somewhat awkward move, and I had to be very careful with it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is preview the kinds of games we have on offer today. Obviously, this is far from comprehensive. These are just the ones I happen to have played, and I'll give you my background with the Xbox 360 system, so that way you know exactly how I played a lot of these. So, when this came out in 2005, I was actually not gaming very much at the time. So I gamed a lot as a kid, and then I graduated high school in '04. And at that time, I still had my PS2. I went to college, and I played sometimes, but it usually just my PS2. And I did play a little bit of Xbox and Xbox 360 for other people's stuff, but not often at all. Fast forward, went to grad school, still didn't upgrade. So by the time I went to grad school, it was like 2009. These consoles were still expensive at the time. And if anything, I would have definitely upgraded to PS3 at the time. But that didn't end up happening. My sister did get a PS3 right as that generation was going out and The Last of Us released. And it looked cool, but I felt like the controller seemed a little cheap compared to the PS2 controller, which seems to have a little bit more quality. And then I got to Columbus, Ohio, and I began my PhD program. So this is 2013, and I still couldn't really afford one of the new systems, one of the newer systems, even though now the Xbox One was coming out and PS4. But I did find an original Xbox, and so I got one of those, played it for a couple of years, had a lot of fun with it, enjoyed the controller. And so then a couple more years passed, 2015 rolled around, and now I'm actually thinking seriously about getting an Xbox 360 or PS3 and taking advantage of the low prices, because I noticed at the game stores, these things are now dirt cheap, and the games for them are a handful of dollars. And keep in mind, at this time, I also didn't know about a lot of the online sales, so you can still get things super cheap a lot of times online if you download the digital version. I wasn't really aware of that, so I was mostly just focusing my purchasing decisions on what was available at the stores. And ultimately, I decided to go for the 360 because it had better backwards compatibility with the previous generation, as opposed to the PS3, which, unless you get one of the originals, only plays PS1 games and doesn't really do much PS2 stuff. So that was a factor. Another factor was that I just think the controller's better for the 360. And so I decided to go for the 360. I picked up a really nice unit, one of the ones with the larger hard drives, and one of the ones that was a late release, so it didn't have any of the issues that some of the earlier ones had, like the Red Ring of Death. That one actually got stolen, so there was a power outage, and that system got stolen, and within it, I had Medal of Honor Airborne. So a couple of cleaning ladies walked into my apartment and took it, and I know it must have been them because they were the only ones in the building when I left. So the power was out. I went to go do laundry, and apparently left my door ajar. So they stole my system. Then a little bit later, I got another 360, the one I still have, which is actually an older model, one of the ones that apparently had the Red Ring of Death issue, although fortunately it's been several years and that has not cropped up. A little bit after that, maybe 2019, I got my Xbox One, and then I got my Series X a couple years after that, because by that point I wasn't nearly as broke and I was back into gaming. But I attribute my return to gaming largely due to the library of the Xbox 360 era. So for the most part, I'm playing all of these games years after they were initially released. Or in some cases, I'll point out when it becomes relevant, I was playing these games in an upgraded version, a remastered version for Xbox One. So that is my personal background with the Xbox 360. And what I'd like you to do is try to guess which game that the Xbox 360 has that the PS3 does not, that influenced my decision to go Xbox 360. So I'd want you to think about that for just a second. So I'm guessing that the sound is just fine then. It will just be me. So yes, you're right. And yes, I am missing a lot of stuff. Partly because some of the games that I have actually covered in the past, I covered on my WTF Gas podcast channel. So I covered all the Call of Duty games, and I covered all of the Battlefield and Medal of Honor games. And so that would have added quite a bit to this list if I'd put those on here. But I don't like to retread ground, especially since I don't really have anything new to say about those. And I don't know if I've really played any of them since. I've played a couple of the newer Call of Duty games, but none of those were Xbox 360. So let's begin with, I believe, the first game I ever played all the way through on the Xbox 360 once I got it. And I was playing on a TV that was not supposed to be compatible with this generation. I still had an older like box TV, CRT. And I played 007 Quantum of Solace. I believe this came out maybe around 2009 originally. And it is a cover shooter, sort of in the Gears of War tradition. I actually replayed this one about a month and a half ago, and it was the first time I had touched it since then. I also at one point picked up the PS2 version, but that version is rough. Anyway, the 360 version, it's a pretty damn good game. It's fairly short, but it's very responsive. The pacing's good. Cover system works. You can have blind fire. You can aim. There are hidden items you can find. So it's pretty much your standard issue shooter in many ways, but the cover mechanics, I think, make it stand out some. It also has a lot of imagery from both Quantum of Solace and the film before that, Casino Royale. So it's the Daniel Craig Bond. It's done pretty well. In general, I think the 007 shooters are a pretty good series, going all the way back to the PS2 and Xbox original lineups. For me, Quantum of Solace is a solid B, and the only thing I can really knock it for is just being kind of on the short side. That being said, it's absolutely worth a play if you happen to find a copy of it for 360 or for PS3. It's a pretty good game. I think it holds up pretty well. And the graphics still look good, even if they're nowhere near cutting edge anymore. So I was pretty pleased with Quantum of Solace. So, next up will be Zone of the Enders HD Collection. So, one of the things that was kind of new about this generation is that you have remastered collections of older games. So, a lot of games from the PS2 era, such as the Zone of Enders 1 and 2, ended up getting remastered. And so I'd never played these originals because I didn't have them. So this was also one of the early things I picked up for 360. I was very pleased with this collection, and this was when I first realized the value and usefulness of these re-releases with a little bit of extra bells and whistles. So up to that point I was kind of skeptical. Why would I want a remastered version of Devil May Cry if I already have the original? But after dealing with Zone of the Enders HD collection, I changed my tune on that, and I now see it's a great way to re-experience something with some slight differences. So if you wanted to replay the same game, but you want a little bit of forward momentum in your life, you want to do something a little different, it's a good way to do it. Or if you're like me and you missed a whole lot of stuff because you weren't playing a lot at the time, that's also a great way to catch up without having to deal with too much clunkiness. That being said, though, like the Xbox 360, PS3 era games, I don't find them that clunky, usually. I mean, sometimes there are things about them that could be a little smoother compared with things that came out later, but for the most part, it's pretty manageable. So it's not like some of the PS1 and PS2 era games where they really show their age. Anyway, for me, Zone of the Enders 1 and 2, great story. The gameplay mechanics are not perfect, but it's a fairly chill game, so it's kind of good to chill out to. It's got a little bit of exploration, a little bit of customization. Combat's decent. I'll say together they're also a solid B. You'll get quite a bit more bang for your buck than you will with Quantum of Solace, but the experience is not nearly as polished or smooth. That being said, still definitely worth playing, and I'm glad that I was able to pick that up. Make sure everything is still going well. Alright. How broke was I? I was in grad school, which means I was like third world levels of broke. And I finally did get a newer TV shortly after that made, allowed me to really play these games properly and use Netflix properly. But that was only because my dad had one he just wanted to throw out. It was heavy as shit. I think it actually technically might have been a CRT, just like a really late model CRT, where it's also HD. And that thing was heavy. I had to literally wrestle it inside because lifting it outright was not going to happen. And then when I moved from that apartment to my ex-girlfriend's place, I had to discard it because the only place for it would have been upstairs, and there was no way in hell I was attempting to lift that thing upstairs. So, but I had good times with that TV. It was a fine machine. It was just one of those that needed to be put in place and left there for its entire life cycle. Alright, next game is Command & Conquer 3. So I've always been a huge fan of the Command & Conquer series. Ever since I was a kid, I remember I played Red Alert when it first came out, and that then got me into the original game, which I ended up liking a little better. So I ended up playing that on Sega Saturn. I used to rent that from Blockbuster. I think I did that at least 3 or 4 times. Later, when I got a PlayStation 1, I picked up Command & Conquer and Red Alert, and then I had the PC version of Red Alert and Red Alert 2. And so, believe it or not, boys and girls, the game that convinced me definitively to go Xbox rather than PS3 was Command & Conquer 3, which was never released for the PS3. So I'm probably the only person in the world for whom that's true. But nonetheless, that is how I did things. So, also fun fact, I barely played it. Despite the fact this was the definitive reason why I ended up going 360. I barely played it. What I have played, though, is spectacular. It's really well adapted to the console controller. So that was one reason I was a little bit reluctant for a long time, because I figured I'd be disappointed and feel like an idiot for putting so much emphasis on the game. Then I ended up playing it, and I was pretty pleased with it. And so for me, it's very solid. It's one I need to get back to and actually complete. One of my problems in gaming, I don't know if I've discussed this before, but I really like to play through and beat earlier games before I go to later ones. So I'm not someone who can jump into a series on the 5th installment and just be okay with that. But of course, it's also very difficult to go back and play some of the older games. And I have beaten the original, but I've never played the sequel. And I also have never beaten Red Alert 1 and 2. But maybe I should just get over that, because sometimes playing through those games is probably not all it's cracked up to be. So for me, Command & Conquer 3 is an easy A. I think that this game is very well put together, very playable, very fluid, and I'm really impressed by how they were able to make that work on a console in that way. And I imagine it would be even better if I had a mouse and keyboard, but it's really not needed. They did a great enough job adapting the controllers that was totally unnecessary. Next up, we have the obvious next game to pick up, and that is Red Alert 3. So, Red Alert 3 was also on the PS3, for those of you who might be curious. It is basically the same game in terms of the game mechanics and everything, but a different story. This game introduces the Empire of Japan as a playable faction, and it goes back to the zaniness that's always been a big part of the Red Alert world. And I will say the opening cutscene has Tim Curry in it, which is always a win. And yeah, so this is a great game. I don't know if it's quite as good as Red Alert 2, which, in my opinion, Red Alert 2 is probably the best Command & Conquer game ever. That being said, I still haven't played all of them. I'm not a big PC gamer, so for instance, I've not played a lot of Generals. But, yeah, Red Alert 3, very worthy successor of Command & Conquer 3. I'll also put it in the A tier. Very pleased with it, and I don't have a complaint in the world about either game. We had our first disconnection of the new era. Of course we did. Yep. Anyway, we're back now. I don't know if you guys are back yet, but I am. So let's keep moving on. Next we have Perfect Dark Zero, which I believe was a launch title. It's a sequel to Perfect Dark for the N64. I gotta be honest, I was never a big fan of any of the N64 shooters with the exception of Doom 64, and I do not get the appeal of Perfect Dark Zero. This game is plodding, navigation is difficult, the controls are kind of stiff, and yes, I get that it's a launch title, or nearly a launch title, but so was Call of Duty 2, and that played just fine. So I assume that a lot of what drove this game was that it was one of the few games out at the time, it looked good, and I assumed was a one-off that would never come back. That being said, I really have never been able to get into this game. I'm not a fan of it. For me, Perfect Dark Zero, if I'm being generous, is a D. And now we get to the Halo franchise. And I believe one of them I left off was the Halo Remaster. So yeah, I guess I forgot to put that in there, but there was a remaster of the original Halo for the 360 that came out in 2011. And I played that version and the original version. I think that that's a really good remaster. I would put that in the A category for sure. Very solid game. And now we get to the Xbox 360 era Halo entries. So Halo 1 and 2 for the original, massive hits. I remember I had a roommate who was extremely addicted to Halo 2. He actually dropped out of college to try to become a professional Halo 2 player. No, I'm not joking. That is exactly what he fucking did. I don't know if he ever succeeded or not, but probably not. Anyway, he was so addicted to it, not to get on too much of a tangent, but he was so addicted to it that one night while I was trying to sleep, he was debating somebody, and he was chastising another person because he could tell from their Xbox Live profile that they had played other games. And he's basically saying that they should only play Halo because it's the only game that matters. And then he told some other kid who was late because he had to go to an internship that he needs to get his priorities straight. And he was not being ironic, by the way, because this person, Carl, had no sense of humor whatsoever. So he was being dead serious, telling somebody, do not prioritize your schoolwork, don't prioritize your internships, get your shit together and play video games. Also, Carl turned me off so much to Xbox that that's partly why I didn't even attempt to play one for several years until I was out of college. So, anyway, Xbox is awesome, but yeah, I did at least live with one fanboy for a year who could make anything seem horrible. Halo 3, though. So, Halo 3 was probably the most popular of the Xbox 360 Halo games. It was fairly early, I believe it was like 2007-ish. I might be a little off on that, but around 2007. I personally was not that impressed with Halo 3. I felt like it was a step down, but also that the other games of that era were a lot better. So let me explain. There are a couple of problems that held back my enjoyment of Halo 3. One is that everything was green or brown. So that was a big problem with a lot of games this era, especially on the 360, is that browns and greens that are hard to tell the difference between them were used for all the backgrounds and for things like that. The problem is that makes levels really hard to navigate because it's hard to tell where there's an entrance, where there's the difference between foliage and a shadow. And this is not a problem that was exclusive to the fact that I didn't have a first-rate TV, by the way, because I played this in higher def on a better screen later. When I was playing the Master Chief Collection, I was just playing through some random levels, and that was still an issue for me. I was trying to figure out, where the hell am I supposed to go? What is happening here? And I usually don't have that kind of difficulty with games. So that was a major hindrance for me. And I also don't remember the story being all that good either, because I know a lot of people are fans of it. For me, the Halo 3 story was pretty blah. Level design was okay-ish. But I remember there's one level where you have to wander through the jungle and you're looking for a downed ship. And that level's supposed to be epic, but it ends up just being kind of obnoxious. So I gotta be honest, Halo 3 was not my cup of tea. I think it's the weakest of the entire franchise. Except for maybe... was that Halo 5? Yeah. So Halo 5 wasn't that good either, but... yeah, Halo 3, I think, is one of the lower points in the Halo franchise, and for me, I'm going to have to put it with Perfect Dark at a D. Next up, we have Halo 3 ODST. So the premise of this is that rather than playing as Master Chief, you instead play as just kind of a... I don't know if you're not even a Spartan, so you're a step below a Spartan. So you're sort of an elite operator, but someone who is not qualified to be a Spartan. And you work with your fire team, and so it's kind of like a little bit of a cross between Halo and a splash of Call of Duty. I personally thought this was a major upgrade over Halo 3 in terms of how the game played. The pacing was a lot better. Navigation was actually doable because of different choices when it came to colors. I liked the idea of playing in the Halo universe as someone other than Master Chief. So you're still someone who's a badass, but you're not really indestructible. You also can play with other people in a way that feels a little bit more realistic rather than, one person taking on the universe, like sort of original Doom style. So Halo 3 ODST for me is a pretty solid game. I would put it at a B. And I think that it in many ways redeems Halo 3 and shows that the engine was capable as long as the design itself was competent. Next up we have Halo Reach. So Reach was a game that came out between Halo 3 and 4. And I don't know why it wasn't counted as Halo 4, but I assume it's because, once again, it was not a mainline story. Reach, in my opinion, had the best design levels of the 360 era Halo shooters. I just enjoyed the overall presentation more. The mechanics were the best. And the graphics were at least as good as Halo 4's. And mostly, by the way, I'm judging these on single player because I'm not a big multiplayer guy. So these are mostly, we're talking about single player for the most part. So Halo Reach, for me, is the pinnacle of the 360 Halo games. I'll put it in the A category. Very solid game. And that's one I will probably end up revisiting. So of all these that I would play through and through, that would be the one to go to. Then there's Halo 4. I thought it was decent, but it was definitely not as good as Halo Reach. It was better than 3, but probably worse than Reach or ODST. And in general, I have to say about all of these Halo games from this era, they don't have nearly the same level of storytelling or world building as 1 and 2. And in fact, I think 1 is still the one that did by far the best job of storytelling. These other ones are okay at it sometimes, but they're not nearly as good. For me, Halo 4 is a C. I think it's a very average game. And I am somewhat puzzled by the fact that the offshoots, at least to me, were much better and more entertaining. Speaking of offshoots, another one that was really top-notch was Halo Wars, which is an RTS game designed exclusively, or not exclusively because it also came out on PC, but designed specifically with the needs of gamers who are console bound in mind. So it's designed as a way to create an RTS game that you can play with a controller comfortably and not miss your mouse and keyboard. And it succeeds in that. So it's a very basic stripped down RTS. It's got a few different modes in it. And I would say that you can probably get around 20 hours of enjoyment out of it before you've kind of exhausted your capabilities or the possibilities of the game. So it's a decent game. It's not long or particularly deep though, but it's fun. I enjoyed it, and I played the Xbox One version, the remaster, which is a little bit better, but not a whole lot. And it was good enough that I do plan to play Halo Wars 2. So that's, an endorsement of sorts. I would give it a B. I would say it's pretty decent. Could have been a little deeper, could have been a little longer, but otherwise not too bad at all. Next up, we have Double Dragon Neon. So Double Dragon Neon is a sort of high-gloss 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up using a lot of animation. So it's not trying to be retro style, it's trying to be of the graphical fidelity of that era, but also using a heavy 80s aesthetic. And so you collect things like cassette tapes as you go along. And this game was a little controversial. It's kind of a budget title. A number of people thought it was too budget, that it wasn't pushing the envelope in any way, or that it deviated too much from the older Double Dragon games. And that was a real problem with beat-em-ups in this era in general. So I remember there was also a controversy when they ported over the arcade game for Ninja Turtles. And they ported over the Simpsons arcade game, which of course I did not own a console at the time to download. Or back during the original Xbox era, with one of those more modern Ninja Turtle games, you could unlock the arcade game, and they made alterations to the music, and that created an uproar. So this was a problem that started to crop up, is how much can you alter the original, but also how duty-bound are you to make improvements in some way. And I think Double Dragon Neon's reputation suffered a little bit because of that. That being said, it's a serviceable game. I enjoyed playing it. It was fairly short, but in this case, that's exactly what you wanted to beat 'em up. Unless it's something with the depth of like a Streets of Rage 4, something that's really well designed and fun to play, just make it quick and dirty. Don't worry about it being something that somebody can treasure for the rest of their life. As long as it's serviceable, it's fun for, 4 or 5 hours. You can maybe replay it once or twice, go back and unlock some stuff, get a couple achievements here or there. That's good enough. So for me, Double Dragon Neon is a solid C. Good for what it's worth, but hardly a must-play. Before we get to the other 80s extravaganza, let me check and see what's happening. All right, back to our list. So I'm familiar with the Far Cry series. I own a number of them, including 2 and 3 for 360. I also have the original one for the original Xbox, and I have, I guess it is like a remaster of the original on 360. I haven't played them yet. And then I have 4 and 5 for the Xbox One. So it's a series that I know has a lot of potential because I've played Blood Dragon. So Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon is kind of like an offshoot of Far Cry 3. It's the same engine. It's a little shorter. It's probably a 15 to 20 hour game as opposed to the 40 to 50 hour runtime of the full games. And it's a very 80s sci-fi aesthetic. So everything is presented as if on a digital plane. All the jokes are very 80s. And this is kind of what games would have looked like if the Sega Genesis in the early 90s had been capable of doing 3D. So this very much has that vibe. And it also will do some fun little retro things, like to make things a little bit retro-y. For instance, sometimes they'll make animations that won't move. So in cutscenes, the animations look like they're out of a Genesis game. So it kind of has like a comic book feel at times. And it also plays up the 80s action movie genre tropes, such as when you're rescuing scientists, the instructions on screen will be rescue the nerds. So it's a lot of fun. It's a great game. Pretty short, but again, very good for what it is. You can also hunt some animals. Definitely doesn't outstay its welcome. And like I said, it got me to invest in the series, even though I've not had the time to actually play a lot of the games in the series yet. But I had a blast playing this. I also played with friends for this one. So there are a number of games from this era. Once I got my system, I would have friends over. I'd go over to their place and we'd play. And this was one of the games that we had the most fun with just because of how sort of goofy and over the top it was. So partly just because of the memories I had with this game, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the S tier. And I highly recommend Blood Dragon to anybody who has not played it. It's fantastic. Next up is Brothers in Arms, Hell's Highway. So I actually discovered and played this before I knew there were 2 prequels to it. And unfortunately, when I looked those games up, I found the quality of those was drastically lower. So I was not able to get into the earlier Brothers in Arms games on the PS2 and original Xbox. They're just a little too rough, a little too unpolished. And trying to command men around the field in those games was a chore. Whereas in this game, they have things figured out. And so this game is quite well done. Now, story's pretty good. I was pretty satisfied with that. The graphics were not quite AAA for the time, but they were serviceable. Controls are decent. And you did have the ability to order your troops around. So you're playing kind of a sergeant rather than playing just, an indestructible badass. So you will have to do a lot of the fighting yourself, but again, you can rely upon your guys to help you out. And you will need to learn how to command in order to win. So you can't play this Call of Duty style like a Rambo. And I like that. It's different. It's got its own feel. The story is also kind of melodramatic, but in a way that's different than like your Call of Duty melodrama. Because these are mostly men who are dealing with physical stress, emotional distress, and they're just trying to do their jobs and get through the war. So these guys are not hyper-motivated special soldiers. They're your typical GIs of World War II, kind of. And so I'm very much a fan of Hell's Highway, although I must admit that I was deeply, deeply disappointed by 2 things. One, that the previous games in this series were really rough, and 2, that this was the end of the series. So I feel like they had just gotten things figured out. They were on a roll. They knew how to make a very distinctive, fun shooter, and then for whatever reason, this franchise did not carry forward. So I will put this game in the B tier. I feel like it's very solid. Definitely worth playing, even if it's not quite a must-play. And even though I'm not a big World War II fan, I mean, you see that I don't really upload a lot of World War II stuff on my channel, I do like World War II shooters. And so fairly recently, I was at a used game store, and I found Hour of Victory, which I'd never heard of before. And so I bought it, and figured this might be cool. In this game, you choose between a few different soldiers who have different specialties. One of them is an explosives expert, for instance. One is a sniper. And then you play through a few different levels, and you shoot your way through, get to the end, take some objective. Very basic, straightforward stuff, really. And each of these characters does play a lot differently in terms of their strengths and their equipment. So there is some strategy, potentially. The concept itself isn't bad. The problem is that the execution is awful. So this game looks pretty poor for the era. Plays like absolute shit. The difficulty is too high for what it is. So based on what they're asking you to do, it's too hard in the sense that it's just not good enough to warrant that much effort. So that's why if your game's not that good, just make it a little easier so that way people can get through it and not feel resentment. And this game really should have just either invested in the quality or made itself more playable, because a lot of people would have gutted it out. So, for instance, I've played a lot of games that probably aren't that good just because I'm a bit of a completionist. And so you can trick probably a whole lot of other people other than me just by not making someone work too hard for something that's really not a valid objective. I don't know why I'm giving game developers advice on how to screw me out of money, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. For me, Hour of Victory it's got to be low. I'm going to go with an E. I think that if you really are dedicated to this, you can probably gut it out, but it's just not worth it. And this really, honestly, would not have even been that great of a game on like the PS2. It would have been physically impressive, or graphically impressive, but it would not have been really a game that I would even recommend there. Speaking of World War II-esque shooters, this one is an alternative history take. It's called Turning Point: Fall of Liberty. And so the premise of this is that the U.S. has fallen in some way. The Nazis won World War II, or at least are winning. I forget the exact premise, but the story is kind of interesting. And you have to lead missions to try to stop them. The problem is that this game is glitchy. So the premise is kind of cool. You got some experimental weapons from, I think, an alternative late 40s, so in that way it's kind of like the Wolfenstein games that began to come out at the very end of the 360 era. But, again, it's glitchy. It's very eccentric in the way that things are handled. It's also kind of arbitrary how to trigger things sometimes. I remember being very frustrated trying to get something to, like a level to end, or I think I had to replay something because an enemy didn't die in the right spot, or there's just like a lot of little dumb things that really should have been ironed out before this thing was released. And I find that just frustrating, and I think those kind of errors are kind of what prevents me in many cases from buying new games. So at this point, I almost have a philosophy of waiting a couple of years at a minimum before I get a game, because of how many games are released with bugs, because I want to actually play a game the way it's supposed to be, not how it had to be to meet a deadline. And I'm not a beta tester. I'm not getting paid to test a game and make sure that it works right. That should have already been done before I spent money on it. And Turning Point is a pretty good example of a game that falls into that camp. Now, unlike Hour of Victory, it is a little more entertaining. I was able to get through it. I didn't enjoy it, really. And now that I think about it, I really should have just quit. I don't know why the hell I finished it, but I did finish it. It's an E. And speaking of sort of alternate history, there's also Homefront. So there was a predecessor for this in the previous generation. I can't think of the name of it, but it's by the same developer. And it was a little bit more of like an RPG. This one is more of a traditional first-person shooter. And there's also a game called Homefront: The Revolution that came out on Xbox One and PS4. But that game was like unfinished. So it was released, and you could tell by how sparsely populated the world is that they didn't quite finish it. So of that trilogy, this Homefront is the masterpiece. So I think the writers of this were the same people behind Red Dawn from the 80s. So the Charlie Sheen movie, where the Soviets invade the U.S. and mostly using Mexican paratroopers overrun everything up to Colorado. And then, of course, they have to turn to their high school quarterback, who I believe is Patrick Swayze, in order to lead them to victory. And the ridiculousness in Homefront reaches that level. And in a video game, it actually works better than in a movie. But they also do have a couple scenes that are supposed to be powerful and kind of are. So there's one scene, for instance, where you're in a mass grave. So Homefront, I think, is pretty much the magnum opus not only of the Red Dawn writers, but also of this concept of defending the U.S. against foreign aggression in the modern era. That being said, this game is very short. I believe it's maybe 4 to 5 hours. Mechanically, it's pretty much on par with something like a Call of Duty or a Battlefield. It works the same way. Pretty much all shooters now kind of play the same way. at least very close, unless they're cover shooters. So for me, Homefront, I would say is a B. So if you're really into kind of goofy, fun storytelling, I would recommend it. Make sure everything is still flowing and going. Right, so somebody doesn't like the Prius ad. 57 miles per gallon, though. That does sound kind of good. All right, next up we have XCOM Enemy Unknown. So I'd heard about the XCOM series for a number of years, the PS1 version and its PC equivalent, but I'd never gotten to play it. And so once I got my 360, XCOM was one of my first purchases. And I've had an absolute blast with this game. So this game is one where it combines strategic management with some pre-scripted story events. So as you go along, you have objectives like find a downed UFO and get parts of it, and you development that way. You also have a squad of men you manage, and they level up as they survive missions. If they get wounded, you can save them, but then they lose a little bit of effectiveness because they kind of lose confidence. And you can develop your technology across the board. You can also make decisions about what you build. You make decisions about which countries you prioritize. And that's important because if you lose the support of a country, you lose the resources. And if you lose enough countries, you lose the game. So I feel like it's a fairly basic setup. It kind of runs like a board game, but it works really well. And it's just the right level of complexity for this kind of game. In terms of unit variety, everything else. I think that this game nails it perfectly. If it's a game that you plan to play for maybe 50 hours, this is perfect for that formula. And so for me, XCOM Enemy Unknown is an S-tier game. It also has really good battle scenes. So you have your little tactical turn-based battles that are a major part of advancing the story within your strategic framework. So you get both the strategy and the tactical stuff. So I think it's very well balanced in that way. The pacing's great. Music is great. The graphics are really good for this kind of game. And there's a little bit of humor because, of course, it's kind of ridiculous with these like aliens in disguise, some of whom don't pass at all. So anyway, it's great balance in all ways. I'm really impressed by Enemy Unknown. It's probably one of my favorite games of all time. Well, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but maybe it's like if I were to make a list of my favorite games of all time, it's probably like in the 11 to 20 range, I'd guess. And then they came out with a cover shooter version to take advantage of the popularity, and that was called The Bureau XCOM Declassified. This one is not as good. It's also not as good as Quantum of Solace, which was another cover shooter. So I think sometimes because of how big of a downgrade this was from previous games in the XCOM series, and because it was not strategy or tactics, people were very, very harsh on it. And I understand why, because again, this was a departure and not in a good way. That being said, I can assure you there are far worse games than The Bureau Declassified, or whatever it's called, The Bureau. It's sort of your standard shooter in a way. You also have sort of scenes between levels where you can upgrade weapons or trade out weapons. You get briefings. You feel like you're part of a fire team and you get to help make decisions. And then you go into the levels and it's kind of like your traditional shooter then. So it's actually a formula that's used with greater effect by a lot of other games, including something like Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Or was it Black Ops, which one? Cold War, Black Ops Cold War. Where you have these scenes in between battles and you can kind of pick and choose your fighting a little bit. So in that way, it's a few years ahead of Call of Duty. But it is a little bit glitchy, so this game was a bit of a cash-in. I don't think the critics were wrong about that. So they are trying to cash in on the name recognition of XCOM. And overall, I would say it's maybe a D. I don't think it's as good as Halo 3, but I still can't bump Halo 3 up any higher based on my experiences with it. But the Bureau is certainly better than Hour of Victory or Turning Point because it is a playable game. There's nothing about it that's fundamentally broken, even though there are some glitches and points of weirdness. But I would say it's probably more fun than Perfect Dark Zero. Even though Perfect Dark Zero is probably a more quality game, the Bureau is more fun. So that's why I'm ranking it where I'm ranking it. And finally, in that series, we have XCOM Enemy Within, which is a standalone expansion of Enemy Unknown, and I think it came out a year later. So this one is just Enemy Unknown with more stuff. So you got more units, more missions, more possibilities. But personally, I think that Enemy Unknown was the better balanced experience. You don't necessarily need every unit type in the world to have a good game. For instance, with the Command & Conquer series, I've always preferred the base games over the expansions. I don't necessarily need a Tesla coil tank or all the fancy units that came out in all the expansions. Sometimes I think playing with the more traditional units makes for a better experience because a lot of those special units, you have to find really unique and specific ways to make them work. And that's especially frustrating on levels where, because of the way these units work, and then because of the constrictions of the level, you're forced to play in a very, very specific way to get to a linear objective. And so for the most part, I'm not a big fan of those kind of expansions that focus on special units. I don't know if Enemy Within falls into that trap, but what it does do is, I think, make the pace a little too rapid. So strategy games should not be ultra fast-paced. That being said, if you played a lot of Enemy Unknown and you want a harder experience with some more possibilities, it's great for that. And actually, I would put it in the A tier. So if that is what you like, it will be a great experience. But personally, I think that Enemy Unknown is the better choice. It's just more fun from my perspective, better paced, and just a better overall concept. Now, next up we have a game that I think is exclusive to the 360. I might be wrong about that. But Alpha Protocol is kind of an action RPG type game, mostly with shooting, but with some other stuff happening too. I want to say it's third person, if I remember correctly. It was published by Sega, which, to be honest with you, I'm a big Sega fan, so that's why I bought it. So I found it at a store which recently went under, by the way, as I found out last week. But this store would have Xbox 360 games for like $2, $5, whatever it might be. And so I picked up Alpha Protocol, and turns out to be a great game. It's kind of goofy. So you're a special agent, you travel around the world for the US government, you go on missions, and you also have some goofy compatriots who help you along the way. So one of your friends in this game is some guy named Sean, and he apparently did a lot of waterboarding with an empty bleach bottle. And then he was so proud of his skills as waterboarder that he actually dedicates the bottle to you and says, like, remember all the good fucking times, and he's got his signature on it. And then he puts it in your apartment or your safe house. So while you're preparing for your mission, you find all these goofy artifacts from these weird over-the-top characters. And it's also kind of a fun commentary on the War on Terror era, where some of the people you're working with are clearly completely and totally insane. But they're jolly in their insanity. And that makes them entertaining, but it also lets you know maybe some of these people are not trustworthy. Maybe they shouldn't be allowed to wander about in this way. Alpha Protocol, if it suffers from anything, it's probably that it's maybe not on the cutting edge of that era. So I believe this came out around 2009 or 2010, somewhere in there. So it did feel slightly dated, but overall, decent design, decent controls, although nothing spectacular control-wise. I enjoyed it, and I would put it in the B category. This game is not an exclusive, but it was one that I think kind of defined the era, and that game is Saboteur. So in this game, you are an Irish race car driver who happened to be in, I believe, Germany when Germany invaded France. So for some reason, even though everybody in Europe knew that war was imminent, you didn't, and this got you stuck in wartime France. And so you, as this Irish race car driver, are now a civilian living in occupied Paris, and you find yourself joining the French resistance. And so you have a lot of options in the game in terms of what you can do. You have a lot of missions and side missions. So in many ways it's structured kind of like a Grand Theft Auto style game, or kind of like a Yakuza game where you can kind of go and operate in different areas. And so it's possible to liberate parts of France before the Allies show up by yourself. You can also fight a variety of different ways. So for the most part, the controls do not reward Rambo-style gameplay. It's a third-person kind of shooter. But you can even the odds by setting traps. You can also utilize stealth, which is relatively effective. And there's a lot of roof jumping in this game. So you can explore by the rooftops. And the story's pretty decent, but in a goofy way. And of course you have a rival, some Nazi guy who's both a scientist and a race car driver. So you've got that rivalry to play out from the beginning to end. It also has a lot of film noir aesthetics, which I really enjoyed. So for instance, you can, when you beat the main story, you'll notice that the tone shifts a lot. Another thing you'll notice is that when you liberate an area, it will go from black and white, it's kind of like a very film noir look, to being in color. So depending on how denazified an area is, that affects how much color you can see. So there's a lot of really cool little stuff. The things that hold it back are that the combat can be a little frustrating at times. So if you don't plan it carefully, it's hard to fight your way out. So in this way, it's kind of an asset because it's kind of like Metal Gear Solid. You have to think carefully before you fight. At the same time, though, some of that control clunkiness is just that clunkiness. So it's a game where you're supposed to have the option of being able to just kind of Rambo your way in, but sometimes that's difficult just because of the controls. The other problem is graphically, although the aesthetics in this game are super cool, the graphics were kind of dated by the time it came out. So this was really more of a AA than a AAA title. That being said, I would still give it an A. I think this game is solid, and I'm not the first person to say this, but this game needs a remaster. So this game would benefit immensely from a remaster. And you wouldn't really have to change all that much aside from just making the game look better and run smoother. So that would be a pretty easy fix. And then you would have, I think, a game that would be guaranteed to move some copies. And part of the reason why people are so desperate to get a remaster is because this game is not backwards compatible. So to play this, you have to run it on the 360. And that same applies to Alpha Protocol. Which, by the way, Alpha Protocol is another really good candidate for a remaster. Next up, we have Fight Night. I think this one's Fight Night Champion. So this one I only discovered relatively recently when I was playing on Game Pass. I played a lot of Fight Night 3 on the PS2. I had a pretty fun time with one of my roommates because he was like a super jock. And he said he was going to overpower me because he knew in real life he could overpower me because he's a football player. We both chose Muhammad Ali, and then his strategy in the fight was to overpower me. So all I did was just sidestep and punch, and I knocked him out within like 2 rounds. So this has been a game he'd been playing for weeks. I'd played it for like 5 minutes, and I kicked his ass. And he got so mad he had to leave and take a walk. So that was fun. Anyway, Fight Night Champion is a little less fun, but it does try to do something new. So rather than either taking a generic person or some past champion and playing through the ranks with them, you instead play a fighter named Bishop, or whose nickname is Bishop. You start off in one weight class, you're a rising star, you get framed for a crime, and you do your time, you go to prison, you come back out, and you try to get things going again. So there's a story, you've got characters in it, so that's different than the previous Fight Night series. But some of the fights are kind of bullshit. So it was one I got stuck on where I think you get shivved or poisoned at the beginning. Or it's something where you have to win in a very, very specific way that the mechanics make ridiculously hard. So those scripted fights make this a little bit too hokey and weird. And not to mention that in any kind of fighting game, at least for me as someone who's not ultra coordinated, there are some moves I don't do because I just don't have the hands to pull them off consistently. And I feel like one of the appeals of Fight Night has always been that it's all about moving the right analog stick to get your punches in. So it's something that you don't have to know a lot of combos for or enter a bunch of codes like a Mortal Kombat type game. So it's very much a thinking fighting game rather than a how fast and how smoothly can you press 3 or 4 buttons at the same time. And so I feel like in many ways it's kind of a betrayal of the Fight Night formula. That being said, still a decent game. Not bad by any means. I'd put it in the C category for what it is. Pretty decent. That being said, I definitely prefer the older entries in the series. And I think Fight Night 3 and 4 might have come to the 360, but I've never encountered them. So, one genre of games I actually really enjoy is games that simulate basketball. And I'm more of an NBA Live fan, but of course today that's a difficult thing to be because NBA Live does not come out that often. I don't think it's come out since 2019, so yeah, it's been a while. So once I got to the 360, I began to try the 2K series. And there are several of them I've played, and I'll talk about my experience with each one. So I played some of the older ones before 2K12, but not enough to really rate them. So I played some 2K10 and 11, but not enough. I also played, I think, 2K7 and also 9 and 10 for the PS2. And those are interesting games in their own right. They're pretty good, better than you might expect, given that the PS2 was more or less unofficially dead by that point. So let's talk about the 360 era 2K games. So 2K12 is one where you have sort of a Legends mode where you play legendary teams and unlock them and all that. I believe 2K11 is the one with the Michael Jordan mode. So 2K12, yeah, that's the Legend teams. And so those matches are pretty damn difficult, but they're worth it and they're a lot of fun. 2K12 also has a really good soundtrack. So a lot of the 2K games, their soundtracks are either hit or miss. For instance, 2K13, I'm not a big fan of the soundtrack, but 2K12, pretty much all the songs in that slap. Graphically, it's an upgrade from 2K11. Another thing they have, not for the first time, I think it's the third time they've had it, but they've got the My Career mode. And this is the first time it's actually good. So before, you start off as like a 40 overall, meaning you can't do jack shit in a game. Now you start off in the high 60s, which means you're still pretty bad, but at least you can move around. And so you earn points as you perform in games, and you can upgrade your character and eventually become a star. What ended up stopping me in this game was not really that I got tired of the My Career and the auto-generated rookies and all that stuff. It's more that I played through 3 or 4 seasons, I put in a lot of time, and what ended up happening is that the game totally crashed once I won the championship. And then it was over. And I think that might have just been a thing peculiar to my copy, so I don't think that was a common experience. But anyway, 2K12 was a fun game, pretty well done, and at this time, they actually put a lot of attention and care into these games. These games looked good for the time, played well, the mechanics felt smooth, and it felt more like actual basketball than anything that had come before. That being said, there still was a little bit of clunk, so I'll go with the B for this one. 2K13, very similar to 12. Mechanically, it's still the same. They don't have the shot meter yet. Like I said, I believe the soundtrack was worse. I don't know if there were any other upgrades really. So just by necessity, I'm going to knock that one down a tier because of the lack of innovation. And then we get to 2K14, which also came out on the next generation consoles. And so most people, when they think back to 14, they think of the Xbox One and PS4 versions. However, what they don't realize is that there was an exclusive mode on 360 and PS3. And that exclusive mode is a LeBron James career simulation, where you can go through some of his great challenges and then also go through some hypotheticals. So there's one where you stay in Miami the whole time and compete there with an aging roster of Bosch and Wade. The other one is where you go all around the league and play with people in weird places. Like there's one where you're in 2018 and you're on the Knicks teamed up with Kobe. So 2K14 has a cool mode in that way, kind of like 2K12. That was another mark against 13, by the way, is it doesn't have one of those that I recall. 2K14 also upgrades everything across the board. And again, this is the last generation version by this point. So it's kind of impressive that they bothered to do this. The graphics look better. Gameplay smoother. The shot meter's there, so now you have the option of shooting with the right stick rather than with the X button. It feels good. Looks good. And I don't really have any complaints about it. It's one of those where it's, because it's an old sports game, it's definitely not a must-play by any means. But yeah, this was definitely a huge step forward at the time. And I was pleased with it once I found it. And I played a lot of it. In fact, if I were to fire up my 360 right now and play an NBA game, which I do from time to time, 14 is the best of the lot. And so it's got to be an A. Now, as I said, I was impressed by how much work they put into a last-gen game. And so after playing a little bit of 14, I figured I could take a chance on 16. Because remember, I didn't upgrade to the Xbox One until 2019. And so I'd heard that the versions for the old consoles were lazy, but also a lot of YouTube gaming creators are lazy as shit too. And so a lot of times they make assumptions based on what people assume, and they get away with it. So I figured, why not take a chance on this? So I waited till it went on sale. I got it for probably $20, and I decided to scratch that itch because especially during the playoff period, I really start playing a lot of basketball games. And back then I was also playing a lot of pickup ball at the OSU courts, both inside and out. Anyway, so I picked this up cheap, played it, and this was just a roster update from 2K14. Nothing changed, except there was no LeBron James mode anymore or anything to replace it. But it was basically just your generic 2K14 experience, but with updated rosters. I remember looking at the ratings and thinking that some of those were a little bit suspect. For instance, by this point, Curry had already been MVP, but his rating was the same as before. So his rating from 2K14 to 16 doesn't really increase. And I noticed with the younger players, they weren't putting in that much effort to keep things updated. And so it was a lazy game. And for that reason, because it was a cash-in and because a number of people, including me, spent money on it that could have been spent better elsewhere, I'm going to put it in the D tier. Now, surprisingly, a couple years later, I found 2K18 on clearance. And by this point, I definitively did know better. But I decided, just out of morbid curiosity, to do it. So I got this thing cheap, probably about $10 this time. And oh my god, they really got even lazier. So 2K16, it's a completely functional game. It's just lazy. 2K18, though, not only have none of the rankings been updated, and the 2K14 model is still running strong. So you got this literal same exact career mode from 14 still. So 4 years later, the dialogue, the events, everything else is completely unchanged. The rosters are updated, except that many of the new players don't look anything like what they're supposed to look like. So unless you were number 1 or 2 pick in the draft, you're just a generic blob. But it gets worse, though. So when you play as anyone from any team, the announcers almost always call your players by the wrong names. So the programming is so buggy that you might run around with, say, Draymond Green, and they'll call him a player from the past, like Bob Cousy. So they mixed up the names that badly that sometimes you'll be playing in the modern era and you'll hear a name from the early NBA. It's completely and totally messed up. It also tends to be glitchy in the sense that you see literal glitches on the screen. It doesn't crash or anything, which I guess is about the only thing you can say for it. But aside from that, I mean, this was just a mess of a game, and it should have never been released. And so for that reason, 2K18 is an F. That being said, if I ever were to do a gaming stream, I might actually play 2K18 on the 360 just because it's kind of fun to make fun of just how much of a piece of shit it is. And you never know what names it's going to randomly call out for players. So, yeah, maybe one day if I ever get a gaming stream going, I'll show you some 2K18 on the 360. Because that is some trash. Alright. Next up, we have Blazing Angels 1 and 2. So the original Blazing Angels I played on Xbox, the original. That version was pretty buggy, and those bugs resolved themselves as a lot of repetition. So you're a British fighter pilot fighting by yourself for the most part, and there's one level in particular where the German pilots come over your radio and say, Tommies and Yanks, always bloody Tommies and Yanks. And that line literally just keeps going over and over and over and over and over. Well, the 360 version corrects that, but otherwise it's the same exact game, and it doesn't even look any better. So I believe this was either a launch title or at least a very early title. Mechanically, it's kind of weak. So it's kind of in the style of something like Secret Weapons Over Normandy. It's kind of an arcade-style World War II flying shooter. It is not necessarily all that well designed. The levels are kind of boring. The action, I find, is a little lackluster. And so for me, I'd have to put Blazing Angels down in the E category. And that's a disappointment because another thing I enjoy is a good flight combat game. But most of them I find, unfortunately, suck. And so it's a rare treat when I find one that's good. Blazing Angels was not such a treat. There's also Blazing Angels 2. And I put off trying this one for a long time because, again, I like to play the originals either as far as I can get or all the way through before I move on. But because Blazing Angels 1 sucked, I didn't try Blazing Angels 2 until much later. This one begins with a very tedious tutorial and then is basically just the same game as Blazing Angels but with different aircraft. It has some minor upgrades, including better graphics. Otherwise, it also sucks. It's an E. And then we have Air Conflict, which is a very similar game to Blazing Angels 1 and 2, except that it's designed by Calypso and they knew what they were doing. So this one has a very basic story where you're a mercenary female fighter pilot. You're kind of working with people you grew up with, so you're a bit of a band of misfits. And you're serving with the RAF in an unofficial capacity. And what you do is you're largely working as a wild weasel. So the wild weasel role is that you go in and soften up the enemy before the other planes get there. And so in today's military, they use these to take out radar. So that's kind of what you're doing, except there's no radar, of course. You're going in to take out like AA guns or sometimes to do secret missions. So you're expendable, and I believe you might be nationally French, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a cool game. It's got a little bit of a story. The missions are mostly well designed, although ground attack in this game can be a bit of a headache because of the way that lighting is handled. So I think they actually made it realistic in the sense that when it gets dark, it gets really hard to see stuff on the ground. Which makes me appreciate games that just throw realism to the wind a little bit and just give you reticules and other things that didn't exist at the time. But overall, I would say that Air Conflict's Secret War is a pretty cool way to do this genre, and I'd put it in the B camp. Now, speaking of kind of remastered arcade-style games, on Xbox Arcade, something that was released and is no longer available anywhere now that the store's gone, is 1942 Joint Strike. Also released on PS3, but this game is kind of like the original 1942, except the graphics have been upgraded. So imagine if they had released 1942 on like the PS1, and they had tried to go with or maybe like late Super Nintendo, now I think about it. But the graphics are upgraded beyond what 1942 was, but they weren't modern for 2008 or whenever this came out. And so it looks like a more high gloss version of 1942. It's also a little slower paced. And so that was one of the controversies with this, is a lot of people didn't like the changes. Whereas other people, of course, realized you got to do something different. You can't just re-release things and charge a decent amount of money for them. Personally, I think that it's fine for what it is, but it could have been a lot better. I wasn't that impressed, frankly. But then again, I'm also not a huge 1942 fan. For me, it's a D. It's playable. It's not that bad overall, but could have been a hell of a lot better. And now I'll skip to one of the later releases that I found recently called Jane's Advanced Strike Fighters, or JASF. So this was a sort of late release for the 360. And it clearly is an Ace Combat clone, so it's a modern fighter game. It's also based in a fictionalized world, much like Ace Combat. But it just doesn't do things that well. And I had high hopes initially for the level of realism, because I remember as a kid in the library when I lived on an Air Force base, they had the Jane's publications, and those would be ultra detailed looks at military aircraft. So I figured if it has the Jane's name on it, it has to at least have some realism. But in this case, it's an arcade style game, and it's basically just not an Ace Combat game that kind of sucks. So this one, to me, I'd put it in the D category. It's playable. It's not as good as it should have been. It's like 5 years newer than Ace Combat 6 and still worse. Across the board, by the way. Not just in one way, but across the board. And now we get to probably the best flying action game of the 360. And this game was an exclusive for the 360. It is backwards compatible with Xbox One and Series X, though, and that is Ace Combat 6, Fires of Liberation. So up to this point, all of the previous other 5 games were PlayStation exclusives. So 1 through 3 were on the PS1, 4 and 5 were on PS2, and now for the first time, they put the exclusive numbered entry on a different console. And I don't think this has ever been ported to the PlayStation in any capacity. So this is not available on the PS3, 4, or 5. And I don't think there's a PC port either, but I might be wrong about that. So the game's a bit hidden now, but still very good. Much like 4 and 5, it is story-driven. You are part of a fictional country fighting another fictional country in a war. And you are able to take on massive numbers of enemies and carry ridiculous numbers of missiles. It's arcade flying at its best. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but at the same time, it's not a total joke. And it is not too lighthearted, so it's one that takes the themes of war very seriously, and yet the gameplay, because of the ridiculous numbers of missiles you can carry and how much damage you can take, it's still kind of arcade style and fun while also being serious. And that seems like a hard balance to strike, and most other games that try fail miserably, but Ace Combat gets it right. And so I recommend this game if you've got an Xbox, whether it's 360 or a more modern Xbox. This is definitely worth playing. For me, it's an A-tier game. And I really think that the PlayStation fans who don't have Xbox should petition to get this ported, because it's good enough that you need to experience it if you're into these kind of games. So that's something that I guess Namco, or is it Namco? I think it's Namco, need to get on. Now, speaking of things that were released on the arcade portion of Xbox and also the PlayStation Store, I came across Mortal Kombat the Arcade Collection, where you have Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 in the arcade original form, and all for $10. So that's a hell of a deal as far as I'm concerned, because I loved all three games, and I'm very glad they chose Ultimate 3 over Regular 3, because Regular 3 had a big problem with it, and that problem is no Scorpion. I mean, the idea of having a Mortal Kombat game without Scorpion is ridiculous. Let's face it. No rational human would try to have a Mortal Kombat game without Scorpion, except for whoever designed the original Mortal Kombat 3. Okay. So, there's not much to say here. These games, of course, are hard as hell because they're the arcade originals. It's nice to be able to play an arcade-perfect version of these games on Xbox. Unfortunately, this is not something that was brought over to the modern Xbox store, so unless you downloaded this back when the PS3 or Xbox 360 store was open, it's now gone. This is something that needs to be brought back, in my opinion, and put on the newest consoles. For me, it's a solid B. It's a great value to have. I really love having these games at my beck and call in that way. Super cool. Now on to the Namco fighters. So starting in the PS1 era, I became a huge fan of the Namco games because the Namco games are really intuitive. So a lot of older games I find are, older fighting games are way too complicated, for lack of a better term. So a lot of the fighting games for like even the old school era, like Genesis, Super Nintendo, a lot of them were too combo focused. For instance, Weapon Lord, that game was complicated as shit. But the Tekken and Soul Calibur games are refreshingly simple. You have just a few buttons, and you use your movement to direct blows. So you can have an overhand blow or a side blow with your weapon. Then you have your kicks, and you have blocks. And then you combine those things, and there's some special moves, and that is, I think, the right level of complexity. So Soul Blade on PS1, then Soul Calibur, Dreamcast, which, by the way, is, in my opinion, is the only good fighting game on Dreamcast, and that's a hot take, but it's the only one that uses the analog stick properly. Soul Calibur 2, of course, was a huge hit for PS2, GameCube, Xbox. And then Soul Calibur 3, I have on PS2. I've heard good things, but I haven't played it. But I have played 4 and 5 on the 360. So Soul Calibur 4, as you see on the cover, has Yoda. So Yoda's a playable character, as is the apprentice from Force Unleashed. And I've not played Force Unleashed, so I don't know that much about it except for that it exists, and that I will play it going forward. It's about what you'd expect from a Soul Calibur game. It's more or less just Soul Calibur 2 with a few different characters and better graphics. The modes are pretty much the same, not too much is different. For that reason, I can't go super high with it because, again, it doesn't really innovate in any way. But it's Soul Calibur. And at this point, if you had your friends over, they'd want to play a more modern console. So you probably got your 360 in to play Mass Effect or whatever. Might as well pop in Soul Calibur and hang out with your buds. I'll go to C. Decent. As for Soul Calibur 5, this one was a little bit of an upgrade over 4. Not a lot, but again, they kind of had the formula down. I'll give 5 a B. I feel like it was just a little bit better, but it's very, very similar. Actually, no, I'm going to put it in the C too, because I don't think it really did anything enough different to warrant an upgrade. Very decent game, I believe. But again, it is not one you can play for long periods of time. The sort of weapons mode, or whatever it's called, where you go around and go through a story, is not well done in either game. The story is super generic. And I'm trying to think, is is it these games or is it Soul Calibur 6 for the Xbox One, where you create your own character and play through with that person? Either way, all these games are so similar that it's very difficult to remember the differences between them. So Namco, I think, needs to do some innovation on these games, or to start remastering the old ones, because I wouldn't want them to lose the simplicity of the gameplay, but they do need to do something different in terms of modes, rather than just generic clashes with pirates or whatever, and then you fight a version of Maxi with blonde hair. I mean, you got to do something a little bit more innovative. But so far, they have not. Speaking of other Namco fighters, we got the Tekken games for the 360. There's Tekken 6, and then there's Tekken Tag Tournament 2. So Tekken 6 was pretty solid. It was definitely an upgrade over 4 and 5. So I played 4 and 5 on the PS2, and especially with 4, I was pretty underwhelmed because it was very slow. 5 was a step in the right direction, but I felt like all of them were short of the glory of Tekken 3 in the original Tag Tournament. Well, the Xbox 360 turned things around because Tekken 6 is a fine game. Now, it's nothing truly special, but then again, much like the Soul Calibur games, it's just a fancier version of the older games. And that's fine. It didn't wear out its welcome. It wasn't too long. Could have been deeper, but again, they need to start adding more side modes. I would give Tekken 6 a C also. Again, needs a little more, but what's there is fine. When it comes to Tag Tournament 2, though, somehow I didn't know about this. So despite the fact that I played a lot of Tag Tournament with my sister and with friends over the years, I never knew there was a Tag Tournament 2. And then I discovered it like a year ago. This game's really good. So this is actually an upgrade on the original. It is probably one of the best party games of this era. One of the ones that goes under the radar. At least for me it did. And so for me, Tag Tournament 2, I would go with a B. Now, it might not surprise you to learn that as a Sega fan, I also like Virtua Fighter. So I can't say that Virtua Fighter is something I like more than Tekken or Soul Calibur, but I do like Virtua Fighter. And I played quite a bit of the original Virtua Fighter on 32X. I also played Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn. Beyond that, I've not had a lot of experience with the series. I know about 3, and I played the arcade for that. I played a little bit of the shitty Dreamcast port, and then I played a little bit of Virtua Fighter 4 on PS2. So Virtua Fighter 5, I was excited to give a go, because I'd never really played it. And to be honest, I can't recall whether I have Final Showdown or Ultimate Showdown. I think I have Ultimate. Anyway, this is a really good game. And it's unfortunate that they haven't made a new one since, 2009 at this point? But yeah, Virtua Fighter 5, very solid, good lineup. The original characters have been upgraded some. They're a little bit smoother. The backgrounds and arenas are very nice looking, very interactive, so there are different ways to score ring outs depending on the setting. So everything about this is true to the earlier games while also innovating. The side modes, again, like in most fighting games, are a little bit meh and not necessarily worth it, but the overall action is great. And while this game doesn't have the same cultural resonance in the West as Tekken does, I wouldn't hesitate at all to put this out and ask people to play it. So as long as they have a little bit of an open mind, I think they will have a good time with Virtua Fighter. And this is one that I have on my Series X, so I downloaded this one so I can play that if people come over. Because I feel like it's an underappreciated series at this point. Speaking of things that probably aren't underappreciated, but are about the right amount of appreciated, let's talk about Dishonored. So, this was one of the later games on the 360, but it was, for me, one of the early ones I played. And the reason I was so eager to play it is because I had a friend at the time who had both consoles, and he was raving about how great Dishonored was. So this is already a couple years after it came out, but he was still talking about how kick-ass it was. And so I was intrigued by the possibility of what it could be and the world building, and this game didn't disappoint. Dishonored has excellent world building. The stealth is not perfect, but it's pretty good. You got a pretty wide weapon variety. I think you're at a good level of formidability versus vulnerability for the story to work. The story's good, mission structure's good, city design's good, the characters are cool. I love those books you find and read about the world, so they did a lot of world building. I just thought it was an excellent game, and I've also played the Curse of the Outsider for the newer systems. That's very good, and I plan on playing Dishonored 2 at some point, probably not too far off in the future. So Dishonored for me is definitely a defining game for this generation. It's an S tier easily. And if I were to make sort of a 10 games from this era for the 360 and PS3 you have to play, Dishonored is on that list. Because I feel like it kind of is symbolic of this whole period. So it's just as good of a swan song in its own way as Last of Us was. In my opinion. My humble, but as one of my professors used to say, my humble but right opinion. Now, here's one that might get me in trouble. And this is a Civil War Nation Divided, a History Channel game, which is a first-person shooter. I had the PS2 version of this back in the day, and I thought it was a total piece of shit. I love the idea. I'm all about doing something other than modern or World War II shooters. Even though, of course, it doesn't necessarily make that much sense, since doing a shooter that's first person kind of requires modern weaponry to work. That being said, you could do it with like a Sharps repeater if you're willing to suspend disbelief a bit, or like a carbine repeater or whatever they had at the time, a Spencer rifle, or a 6-shooter. Hell, just use a 6-shooter. But even leaving aside the weapons issues, the gameplay here is trash. It seems like all the gameplay corridors are very narrow. You have to move in very linear patterns. You can't use the sides of paths because they've not been rendered right, so they're just kind of there visually but not physically. A lot of errors are made, and those errors are also repeated on the 360 version, so it's not just the PS2 version. And so because of those errors being present, I don't get how anybody likes this game, I'll be honest. Now, I understand why people were excited that they're trying different periods of history. And I applaud the effort. And I want to encourage that. And that being said, though, don't do a shit job. Do a good job. Make a good game. And because of how bad this was, I've never played any of the other History Channel games. So I know there's like a Medieval Warfare one. Never played it. There's also one on Patton. And it's like more of a strategy game. I've never played that. And the reason I've never played them is because I fucking hated this game. They were using the History Channel label and a cool topic to sell merchandise without putting in the work of developing a decent game. So for me, the Civil War game is an F. It's a piece of shit. It's probably the worst shooter on the Xbox 360. And that's saying a lot considering half the games were shooters. So I'm sorry, but not sorry to anybody who enjoyed that game. If you enjoyed that game, you need to have better taste. I'm sorry. I'm just going to throw it out there. Next up, there was a standalone Wolfenstein game at this era that came out in 2009. So there was a little bit of a trilogy in the early 2000s, or was it a trilogy or just a one-off? I can't remember, but there were different versions of it. I guess it's probably like one game, but with different versions for the PS2, PC, Xbox. Then there's the 2009 version, and then you get the trilogy that starts, or not, it's not a trilogy, why do I keep saying trilogy? You get the series that starts with, was it New Colossus? I can't remember the subtitle, but you've got, New Colossus, Old Blood, New Blood, and I don't remember the names, the subtitles, because those are mostly Xbox One games anyway. But there is an attempt in 2009 to get the series off to a fresh start, and I think it's an underrated game that gets forgotten because of that later series that came out in 2014. So these games are more focused on the supernatural elements of Wolfenstein. So whereas the later games focus on the character of B.J. Blazkowicz and his family and kind of a little bit of zany humor. This game is much more about the supernatural elements. And in this game, you can do things like transport through walls if you're using special powers. So the Nazis have dug up a bunch of artifacts and they've created amulets to give them powers. You get one too, and you combat them. You fight them in all kinds of underground catacombs, and it's a cool game. It's a cool concept. The only problem I had with this Wolfenstein is that navigation in this game is a chore. And as someone without a very good sense of direction, who gets lost in real life all the time, I don't want to do that in games. So for me, that part is frustrating. Nonetheless, though, it's still a good game. And I think that if this developer had had more time to work with Wolfenstein, that this series could have actually been better than the one that came out in 2014. But that, of course, never happened, and so this game is largely forgotten, but I'd say it's still a solid B. And if you're a fan of Wolfenstein at all, I recommend checking this out on 360 or PS3 if you get the chance. And now we're going to get to a series that I think was defining for this console. So, this console... Okay, now everything's showing up. This console had one new series, so obviously the Halo games are associated with Xbox forever. But they now have a new exclusive series that came out starting in this period, Gears of War. So Gears of War takes place in a really cool universe where everybody kind of looks like they're out of Batman the Animated Series in terms of people's proportions. There's like an alternative race of humans who live underground. There's environmental problems. You got government corruption. Everything about this universe is really cool. And so the world building here is excellent. And I might replay this trilogy just to revisit the story, because there's just so much going on here that's interesting. So the original game, you are in the middle of a great war. You play as Marcus Phoenix, who's the son of a famous scientist, and you're leading your fire team. You're kind of a disgruntled guy who's almost a bit of a dissident, but you're also a loyal soldier. And you have with you a football player named Cole. There's also Damon Baird, who's probably my favorite character because he's kind of a smartass. And I forget the other character right offhand. But anyway, it's a good fire team. You got good dynamics, good dialogue. It's just kind of witty and fun. It's a cover shooter, so you are rewarded for caution and for advancing steadily. You can't really issue orders, but you do need to kind of figure out what your guys are doing and work with them. So if they're hanging back, you need to also kind of hang back. And if they're being a little too cautious, you need to up the ante, and then they'll follow you. So in that way, the AI is pretty decent here. To be honest, I'm basing this rating on the Ultimate Edition for Xbox One, and I have not played the original Gears of War. But what I did play there was really good. So the original Gears of War, despite having a little bit of clunk, was pretty revolutionary for the time. I think it's an A. And again, I think that while the mechanics were good, what really put this game up was its story. So storytelling and world building, excellent in this game. And I played a little bit of the multiplayer, and it's pretty solid for all of these games. And I believe the last time I tried it was a few years ago, and the multiplayer was still running, at least for 2 and 3. Speaking of 2 and 3, 2 I remember being really good. So I already played, so I was downgrading technologically because I went from Ultimate Edition on the Xbox One back to Gears of War 2 on the 360. And yet the game was still an improvement. Mechanics are better. Storytelling is still excellent. I enjoyed the campaign more. And I can't remember if it's 2 or 3, but there's one really effective jump scare in these games where you fall off a bit of a cliff in your Jeep, and then your lights go out, and then they flash back on, and now you got a huge monster right next to you. Just so much fun, and again, witty, good mix of serious, grim, disgusting, cynical. Like it gets the tone just right. So for me, both 2 and 3 are S-tier games. I don't really have any complaints about either one. And I can't remember which one was a little bit better, so I'm going to be generous and put both of them in S tier. Probably, if I had a little better memory of it, I'd put one of them down in the A. But I can't remember if 2 or 3 was the better game. I want to say it was 2 that was the better game, but it doesn't really matter, so we can move on. The fourth and final Xbox 360 entry of the series was Gears of War Judgment. I remember it coming out in 2013, which was the last year that the 360 was the main console before Xbox One came out. This is a spin-off based on the career of Damon Baird, who once had his own fire team before half of them were killed. And so it takes place before the original game. Now, like I said, I'm a big fan of Baird. I actually used his image as the thumbnail of this video. So obviously I like Baird. But this game fucking sucks. And it's not that the game is a massive departure. It's that the developers did not understand the engine. So let me explain very simply. If you have a cover shooter where all of your angles that you can see at are predicated upon distance, you don't make a game that is predicated upon in-close combat, because most of the enemies are low to the ground. So in this game, you're largely shooting at things you can't physically see, and there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot adjust yourself to look down at the enemies you're shooting. So it's a game that rewards taking cover and firing over things, but all your enemies will circumvent the cover and fight you in your grill. And this game makes that frustrating because, again, the controls try to push you toward caution and distance and spacing. But this game's all about melee combat, and it's a mess. And so for me, Judgment was deeply frustrating. I almost quit several times. I don't know how I struggled through it, but I did. I'll put it in the E category. So if this one is ever remastered or re-released, I would love to see them make some changes to make sure the mechanics reflect what they want you to do more. So either change the mechanics to be more about run and gun, or just change the enemy's AI some, and don't have so many small enemies that rush you. Because again, play to the strengths of the mechanics, and avoid the weaknesses of those mechanics if you want to avoid frustrating the shit out of people. You'll notice for a lot of the series, I've played the first game, but not the rest so far. So for instance, the first of those would be Borderlands. Borderlands, I played the Xbox One remaster, and I bought the whole collection. I found it on sale for like $20. The original, played through it, had a good time. World building in Borderlands is pretty good. I enjoy the graphical style. That being said, the story is almost non-existent, and I guess it is what you call a looter shooter. So it's all about finding objects that don't really have much meaning but are just cool or valuable that you use to upgrade and keep finding other objects. And so in many ways, the Borderlands games are a never-ending series of fetch quest. There's not a lot of depth here, but it's kind of fun, kind of stupid fun. And so I put Borderlands as a C. I'll probably play the rest of them at some point, but it's not a priority. I remember playing, it was either the prequel or Borderlands 2 on one of my friend's PS4s back in the day. And that one seemed a little cooler, but I don't know. The original's pretty decent. I think it's about average. And I've heard the movie, though, the Cate Blanchett movie, kind of sucks. But I don't know. Maybe I'll see it eventually if I get bored enough, now that I know the backstory of the game universe. Next up, we have a strategy game, one of several I bought on the console, and the first one that I was ever able to really play, and that was Operation Darkness. So this is a game by Atlas, a company that specializes in tactical RPGs, which is one of my favorite genres. This one sees you play as a group of British werewolves during World War II, and you hunt Nazi werewolves or vampires. And so there are some common soldiers, but most of you have special powers. So it's kind of goofy fun. Gameplay-wise, I'd say it's pretty typical of the genre. This is one of those that will not run on a later Xbox. You have to have the 360 to run it, or I believe it's on PS3 as well. I'm not sure. No, this one is Xbox exclusive. I'm sorry. But there are others like Spectral Force and Zoid's Assault that are also on PS3 that are very similar to this, but I haven't played those enough to rate them yet. So if I ever do a PS3 list, hopefully by then I'll have played those games. Anyway, Operation Darkness, I think it's cool. I think it's a little underrated because a lot of people are harsh on it, but I think part of that's simply because a lot of people are not into the tactical RPG genre. And so I would put Operation Darkness in the B tier. Next up is Metro 2033. So I have the collection for Xbox One, including Exodus, the most recent one, but I've only played the original. It definitely showed its age when I played it, so I could tell this was a sort of late 2000s game. Story, in terms of the world building and storytelling, it was very good. In fact, it was good enough that I actually went out and bought the 2 novels. And so I read Metro 2033 and Metro 2034. I enjoyed both of those, although it must be said the original is a lot better. The problem with the second novel is that the first half of it sucks, and then the second half is good. So you got to get through some crap to get to the good stuff. Anyway, it's sort of set in a post-apocalyptic Russia, so imagine if the Cold War had gone down and Russia had gotten nuked. So the USSR got nuked, and a lot of people survived in the subways under Moscow. So that's kind of the basic premise. The game is fittingly claustrophobic. Controls are decent. The graphics for the time are fairly standard. Mechanically, it's pretty solid. You've got a lot of decent options. You can play through some interesting scenarios. And I enjoyed it overall. I think that there are probably better experiences, and I hope that the sequel, Last Light, made some improvements. But overall, I don't really have any complaints. I would also place this in the B tier. Now we get to the 3 Resident Evil entries for the 360. It's worth mentioning that Code Veronica was re-released for the 360 as well, and I think that would make it the first ever Resident Evil game on a Microsoft console. And then Resident Evil 4 was also ported over. But because those are games from the previous generation, I didn't include them here, and especially because I have not played either version of the 360 variant. But in terms of the other 3 games that were of this era, 5, 6, and Operation Raccoon City, I have played those. And I've got opinions. So Resident Evil 5, much like 4, was primarily an action game. Now, 4 is a really, really good action game. I didn't think it was very Resident Evil-like, but I still love the game. 5, similar vibes, except now I feel like they've maybe gone a little too far in the action direction. Although it is a good action game, it's still not what I think of as Resident Evil. And I just realized what I left off the list that I intended to put here, and that would be Revelations 1 and 2, which are also available on the 360. So that's what I left off. That's why I was at 73 rather than 75. God damn it. Anyway, so we'll talk about them anyway, though, don't worry. So Resident Evil 5, good action game. The Wesker character, of course, is one of the best in gaming history. He's a great villain. Chris and Sheva are fun. There are some good boss fights. I did a bit of grinding in this game to unlock the best weapons and upgrade all my stuff. It's a solid game. I'll give Resident Evil 5 a B. I enjoyed it. I probably put more time into it than I needed to. And then we get to, I can't remember which one came out first. I want to say Raccoon City came out first, but Operation Raccoon City is where you play as an operative for Umbrella who's trying to clean up Raccoon City after the outbreak in, I believe, 2. So 2 and 3 took place where the T-virus is spreading across Raccoon City. So you're sent in as a fire team to deal with the zombies and kill survivors who might tell on you. So it does raise some interesting issues in theory, but in practice, this is a very generic game. It's also very glitchy. So much like The Bureau or Turning Point, you have lots of little glitches, and those definitely inhibit the fun factor. It also just seems lazy and sloppy, so the AI is not very good. So it's kind of like Judgment in that way, where it seems like enemies just kind of bum rush you. And I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. It feels rushed. It feels like a generic Call of Duty ripoff with the Resident Evil theme. That being said, it's still better than Civil War: A Nation Divided, so I'll give it an E. And it's probably a little better than actually, it's definitely better than Hour of Victory. It's probably on par with Turning Point. So within the E tier, that's how I'd compare those. And Judgment, despite how much it annoys me, is probably the best of this tier. So, alright. Next up we have Resident Evil 6. This one is the one where to play the story through in chronological order, you have to skip around some. So you need to play, there are 4 different characters who have campaigns, and if you want to do it, I guess, in the canonical way, you need to play them out of order a little bit and skip around. So I kind of tried to do that. I was playing this in conjunction with friends, the same way I played through the original 2, 3, Veronica, and 4 and 5, but we never finished 6. And the reasons for that are largely that this game is just not that good. The graphics for the time were really top-notch. That has to be said. So much like Medal of Honor Warfighter, this game takes the console to the absolute limit, and the graphics look about on par with the Xbox One or PS4 era. But that's about all the praise I have for it, because this is just a very scripted action game. It feels like it's much more linear even than 4 or 5, which were already fairly linear. It just doesn't control as smoothly, at least in my opinion. I did not really enjoy the story nearly as much. It seems a little unfocused, a little episodic. I think I can put it in the D tier. I think that's about fair. But again, for me, that's not really what Resident Evil's about. So for me, true Resident Evil games are kind of like the original Code Veronica and then Revelations 1 and 2. Especially Revelations 1. So I like resource management element of survival horror, feeling of confinement, sort of working within an area to unlock the puzzles, and combat where you have to be somewhat precise, or you can use avoidance. So those, to me, are the true elements of a real Resident Evil game. And for that reason, I actually really like Revelations, the first one. Even though it was designed to be, I think, a Nintendo DS game, so it was massively underpowered even when ported to the 360. Still, I would say it's a solid game just based on design. I enjoyed the Queen Zenobia and the other setting that you have. For me, Revelations 1 would be a B, and then Revelations 2 would be a C. That one was a bit of a downgrade in terms of story and setting, but it upgraded the mechanics just a little bit. So that's how I'd rate those if I'd remembered to include them. Also, just for context, I played both Revelations 1 and 2 on the Xbox One rather than the 360. But in retrospect, I didn't know this at the time, but the releases for the 360 and the Xbox One were so similar that I actually wasted money getting the Xbox One version when I already had a really cheap 360 copy. But I didn't know that till after I beat it, so there you go. Next up, we have another trilogy for Xbox and for PS3. It was legendary. It was one that I totally ignored for a long time, and I didn't realize how great it was. But that trilogy is the... I'm trying to get to the bottom here. The trilogy is the BioShock trilogy. So BioShock, the premise is that there's an underground utopia of sorts led by a renegade billionaire named Andrew Ryan. He builds this in, I believe, the 1950s or 60s. It's supposed to be the perfect society, free from any kind of communist influence. And it turns into a nightmare predictably. So it's basically a big spoof of Ayn Rand. So Andrew Ryan gives libertarian and Randian talking points, and yet the society that he built has turned into a complete and total clusterfuck. Everybody in it's a total piece of shit. So that's kind of fun. And you enter as, I guess, a fish out of water, to use a bad pun. So the premise is that you're a new arrival. You weren't supposed to be here, but now that you're here, everybody's trying to manipulate you into joining their side and doing their dirty work. And there's a really good plot twist in this one that, in retrospect, is super obvious, but at the time when you're first playing, it's not that obvious. And then when it happens, it's brilliant. The characters in this are fun. Storytelling is great. Mechanics are good enough. And I still put it in the S tier. I don't necessarily think that it's perfect, but it's still an S tier game as far as I'm concerned. And the same applies to BioShock 2. BioShock 2 is a lot like the original, but with just better mechanics. And I don't really have any complaints. Also, BioShock 2 comes with some really good DLC that's worth checking out. At this point, though, just get the Xbox One or PS4 collection that have all the DLC and are upgraded graphically. That's what I did, and these games are phenomenal. I enjoyed every minute of these games. So, BioShock 1 and 2, easy S tier games. As for Infinite, it's a little bit controversial because it does deviate from the formula. So this game takes you to an earlier period where you live above ground, but it's still kind of the same idea. So it's a kind of attempt at utopia, but now in the sky. And you live on some sort of suspended thing that floats above the grounds, that way the government can't tyrannize you. There's a similar right-wing project, but this time instead of being about radical individualism, it's about radical patriotism. This time it's kind of making fun of like Bush-style Republicans, which would have been, I think, the closest equivalent at that time. I think the game came out in like 2011, which means that the designers were making it back when Bush was still in office, and where you have that kind of hyper-patriotism thing going on. So it's trying to make that kind of political statement. I think that was pretty funny because, again, I've always been very, very critical of the hyper-patriot types. Mechanically, there are some cool things you can do here that are new, so you got a little bit more of an open environment, so combat's a little bit more freewheeling. You also feel a little lighter, and you can utilize airborne attacks now because you have that ability. That being said, overall, it's not as good as the stuff before it. And that's where the controversy comes in. I don't think there's anything really wrong with Infinite. I just think it has the problem of innovating a little bit without being as good. That being said, I don't think it should be regarded as a black sheep by any means. It's a fine game. It's just not as good. So for me, I would still put it in the A tier. I still actually enjoyed Infinite quite a bit. But it's certainly not as good as the first two games. And now we get to the Dynasty Warriors franchise, actually starting with Samurai Warriors. So I did play a tiny bit of the Samurai Warriors original for the PS2 and for Xbox. And I knew someone who was a huge fan of the Samurai Warriors franchise, but I was always a Dynasty Warriors guy. So I never really played Samurai Warriors because I'm just not as into that period. But recently I picked up Samurai Warriors 2. I started playing it and I realized that mechanically it's the same game as Dynasty Warriors 5, which was my favorite of the Dynasty Warriors games. So that one never came to this generation. It was on the original Xbox and the PS2. So Samurai Warriors 2 is an updated version of my favorite Dynasty Warriors, so you know I love it. And it's kind of getting me more into the Japanese Sengoku period. So I'm really having fun with it. This one that I'm still playing a bit. So I'm not done with it yet. I have played through a couple of different campaigns, but I plan on playing a lot more of it. The pacing is great. Difficulty is just right. Character selection's good. The way you unlock those characters is very straightforward, so there's nothing that's unusual or ridiculous. Stage design is good. The storytelling, because you're telling the history of that period, is fun. Music is great. I mean, it's a great Dynasty Warriors style game, and I don't have any complaints about it. I'm almost tempted to put it in the S tier, honestly. But I think I will be disciplined and go with A. Because it's not one of those generational defining series, and it's also not anything new, but it just is a really good game, and it's very well done. And now we get to the Dynasty Warriors games proper. So the first one to come out on the 360 was actually Dynasty Warriors 5 Empires. So the expansion. Now, I'm actually not a big fan, like I said, of expansions for strategy games. In this case, it would be an expansion for a beat-em-up. Same thing applies, though. The expansions are usually a waste of time. That being said, I do like the Empires mode, but I feel like it should just be within the main game, because there's not that much to it. That being said, because it is Dynasty Warriors 5, I enjoy the mechanics of it enough that I was able to get some enjoyment out of 5 Empires. I'll give it a C. It's about as high as I can go for one of these spin-offs that really should just be a mode within the main game. Now we get to Dynasty Warriors 6, the first of the games to come to a new console, the first mainline entry. This also came out, by the way, on the PS2, so that was available for the older generation too. And when I first played it, my impression was based upon the PS2 version. Because remember, for me, the PS2 was my main console up until 2013 to 2015. But my impression of what Dynasty Warriors 6 was distorted by that. Because actually it's a fine game. There's nothing wrong with this game at all. It's well designed. It plays pretty smoothly. And it's the last game kind of in the style of 5, where you play as individuals for your Muso campaign rather than as factions, which I prefer. There also were some character redesigns. Some of those were unpopular. I personally thought they were fine, though. I didn't have a problem with them. I like the new characters. The new stage designs were pretty good. I don't think they're quite as good as 5, but still pretty damn respectable. So for me, it's a solid B. I like Dynasty Warriors 6. Good game. Dynasty Warriors 7, to me, is probably just a little bit better. Now, it's a pretty big departure, because what happens now is that you play through each faction, and unlike in, say, Dynasty Warriors 4, where you can still choose which member of the faction you wanted to be, in this case, you're assigned a member. So you go into a battle, and in this battle, you'll play as Sun Ce. Next battle, you play as Zhou Yu. And so on and so on. And so that's how Dynasty Warriors 7 is structured. You also have a camp you go through. And a lot of that is a little bit corny, but it does provide some storytelling and some background. So one example of it being a little corny is that there's one part where there's one person you meet every time you're in camp in Shu, starting with the Yellow Turban period and going 50 years later to the Wu Zhang Plains. And you see this character go from being a shy boy who then asks a girl out and gets married to then being a father of like 3 grown men, and he's there with them as they're about to go into battle for the last time. And they're talking about, yeah, Dad, you're a hero. And, you know, you as the character are like, yeah, you kids have no idea how lucky you are to exist, because this man, despite being able to face battle, cannot talk to a girl. So, but anyway, so there's some fun stuff there, kind of goofy humor. But also, I think the levels are well designed. They're also very fast and furious. So a lot of the challenge is gone, and it's just kind of like an action movie. It's kind of like, what's that movie? Shoot 'em Up, or one of the Kill Bill movies where, you know, you got them just cutting through bad guys like they're nothing. So the basic concept of the game is different than before. And it's kind of like with Resident Evil, the changes in that, I'm not super into the changes in theory, but in practice it is fun. And so I would also give Dynasty Warriors 7 a B. Apparently the multiplayer is not that great in 7, but I've never had the opportunity to play it with anybody else, so I couldn't tell you. And then we get 8, the final game for the 360 and for the PS3. Also, according to most accounts I've heard, the last decent game in the series. I've never played 9, but I've heard things, and those things are not good. Anyway, Dynasty Warriors 8 is very much like 7. Apparently, the main difference is that it really improved multiplayer, but of course I couldn't tell because I didn't do that. And single player wise, I actually think it's a slight downgrade from 7. That being said, it did add more characters. There were some redesigns, reimaginings of different battles, a few new tracks. Still a good game. But really, if you have either 7 or 8, you can skip the other, if we're being honest. Unless you're a really hardcore fan, 7 or 8 serves the same purpose. And these games do tend to run a little high compared to a lot of the games we talked about. So my advice would be just to pick one or the other for the 360 or the PS3. Go with the one you find cheaper, and you'll have a good time. But otherwise, it's not really worth straining every effort to get both. Next up, we have Batman Arkham Asylum. Of course, Arkham City came out right after that, and then there was Arkham Knight. Arkham Knight, I believe, was on 360, but mostly that was designed to be an Xbox One game. This and Arkham City were both 360-era games. I played this on the 360 with a friend, and whenever I play the newer ones, it will be on the Xbox One. So this is kind of a beat-em-up / exploration action game, kind of in the spirit of something like Metal Gear Solid, but with fighting straight out of almost like Dynasty Warriors, actually, now I think about it, just with fewer weapons. Actually, now that I think about it, if you've ever played the Yakuza games, the combat in this game actually feels a little like those. And there also are some RPG elements where you can find new equipment and make adjustments. There's a lot of storytelling. Obviously, you deal with the Joker, Harley Quinn, Croc, and all kinds of other villains. It's a good game. I feel like it's overrated, to be honest, but it's still a good game. Yeah, the boss fights in this one are pretty epic. They're pretty difficult. They will make you want to throw your controller. But if you persist, you will win. Good game. I've heard the sequels are better, but so far I've not gotten around to playing them. If I ever do, then you'll hear about it, I'm sure. Anyway, Arkham Asylum for me is another B. And now we get to probably, of all the great trilogies of this era, at least the one I like the most, and that's Mass Effect. I don't know. I like BioShock a lot too, though. I don't know. That's a tough one. And to be fair, I played more 360 than PS3, so I've not played the Uncharted or Resistance trilogies yet. So it's possible one of those is actually better, but I don't know. Anyhow, with Mass Effect, the original one has phenomenal storytelling and world building. So it introduces a sci-fi universe and does so with storytelling and world building that is next level. The mechanics, for the most part, are good. It's a little bit of a cover shooter, not as smooth as something like Gears of War, but it does have a lot more strategy involved, and it is more of like an RPG. You make decisions about the class of your character, you make decisions about upgrades, and those very much impact gameplay. You also will make impactful decisions. So in this way, you make moral decisions much like you do in the Fallout games, or in something like Jade Empire, or the old Knights of the Old Republic games. So it's very similar to all of that. You also meet people from different alien races, and one of the major themes in this is, I guess, really it's about racism, but it's couched as being about humans not getting along with aliens. So everything in it's well done. It fits together very neatly. The only thing that holds back the original Mass Effect is that the menus in this game are a nightmare. You can't hold that much in your inventory, so you constantly have to go into your inventory and do maintenance work. So you constantly have to break down weapons for parts or sell them, and you continually find new and better weapons, so there's always a need to make sure that you're using the latest and greatest, because your enemies are getting stronger, so you better get stronger too. And so there's pressure to perform in that way, and you will spend a lot of time doing maintenance work. and that part of the game is not very fun. But that's really the only flaw, though. There's also a lot of decent side quests that do some world building for you, and you also have a little bit of DLC with this, although the DLC in the 2 sequels is much more substantial, because DLC was kind of its infancy in 2007 when this came out. So for me, the original Mass Effect is still an A. Revolutionary game, but those menus were a pain. And I don't know, but I've heard that the remasters did something about those menus. So my sister played through the remasters, and I asked her about menus, and she didn't know what I was talking about, which is a good sign. And also the fact that she finished the game tells me that the menus were fixed, because otherwise there's no way in hell she'd have done that. She would have gotten frustrated and quit had the menus been like the ones I experienced. I'm a lot more patient than she is. Except for tech stuff. She's a lot better at this kind of thing than I am, but when it comes to overall patience, I'd say that my patience is more developed. Mass Effect 2, by this point, the mechanics are much improved. And also, Shepard will come back and now work for a shadowy organization. People who might not share his values unless you made certain decisions in the last game. You also meet new characters. All the characters in this are cool. All the characters in the first game are cool too. Most of them come back. I think the overall cast actually gets stronger in this game. I forgot to mention, in all these games you have a lot of romance options. And that's always cool. And I think you can also play as a male or female Shepard. I played as male Shepard and did the Paragon path, so I played as a good guy. But you can play male or female Paragon or whatever it's called, villain, whatever. And you have multiple different partner options. And I believe that by the third game there might have been gay options, but I don't know for sure. Anyway, Mass Effect 2 kind of just perfects everything Mass Effect 1 was trying to do. It's got good DLC. It raises more good issues. And depending on the decisions you made at the end of Mass Effect, this will impact at least one of your playable characters. Because there's one part in the end of Mass Effect where you have to choose between 2 people. So depending on what choice you make, that will impact whether this person is still around for 2 or not. So for me, Mass Effect 2 is an S-tier game. I don't have any problems with it, really. Mass Effect 3, this is a little bit of a step down. Now, mechanically, it's just like 2 from what I remember. The graphics might even be a slight bit better, but not by much. The problem is that it seems a little more rushed. The story's not as developed. And by this point, the idea of assembling your team and then going after some big evil, you've already done that twice. So you as Shepard have to reassemble your team because you were thought to be dead, you're back, and now you got to take care of business and get your guys back together. It's still fun, mechanics are still as good or better than ever, but the formula is becoming a little bit tired, and then the ending for this game is not great. You've probably heard that before, it's true, the ending is not great. I'll give Mass Effect 3 a B. It's still absolutely worth playing, but it is not as good as the first 2 games. And I do plan on replaying this trilogy from the remastered collection. I also need to play Andromeda. But I really want to play this trilogy, but this time probably as female Shepard and as more of like the xenophobic version, since I've already played male Paragon. So that's probably what I'll do. I don't know when I'll get around to this. I don't have as much time for gaming as I wish I did, but I mean, I got other priorities, as you're probably well aware. And so I just have to make do with what time I do have. Next up, we have Ruse. So Ruse is a World War II strategy game. It is, I believe, real-time strategy, but with a little bit of base building. So it is kind of like Command & Conquer in a way. Except that the focus is on usually not large-scale battles, but on kind of recreating historical battles. Like, there's a Kazarine Pass scenario. And so you play as a fictional general who is sort of like an American ace commander. You also have a reporter girlfriend, and you go a little bit mad with power, which is fun. You fight the Germans. Campaign's kind of neat. The storytelling's ham-fisted, but kind of fun. I'm a fan. It's also got a cool multiplayer. I guess on PC you can probably still access it. So I've tried to get other people to play it, but I've had a lot of trouble convincing other people to give it a shot. Even people I know would love it, they won't give it a try for some reason, and that frustrates me to no end. But I think Ruse is a fine game. For me, Ruse is an A-tier game. Then again, keep in mind, I am very biased when it comes to this genre. I love strategy games, so maybe it's a little worse than what I'm saying, but if you like strategy games, play Ruse. And this is one that is, I don't think it's ever been ported to a newer console. I'm not sure if it's backwards compatible or not. Because I played it on the 360 and I've never tried to replay it, so I don't know. Next up, we have Grand Theft Auto 4. So both 4 and 5 came to the Xbox 360. Of course, 5 is better known for Xbox One and PS4. And it's been ported now to Series X and PS5. And people are anticipating 6. So I have a weird relationship with Grand Theft Auto. I love Grand Theft Auto style games. The Yakuza series is a great example. I've talked about that many times. Yakuza series is easily my favorite series. I've also enjoyed a lot of things that are Grand Theft Auto-esque. Including, actually, the Saboteur. For whatever reason, though, I can't actually get into GTA. I don't know what it is, but I don't like GTA. So I played a little bit of the PS2 ones. Didn't really impress me that much. I went back to the PS1 ones. With the overhead ones, I didn't really get that into those. And then I've tried playing 4 for the Xbox 360. And I don't really get the appeal of this one, I'll be honest. It might just be a me thing, because I know like everybody else in the world loves this game. I don't get it, though. To me, it just felt kind of clunky, a little underpowered. I feel like maybe this game was brilliant in terms of its ideas, but I've just seen those ideas copied and done so much better. I guess I'd have had to play this game when it came out, and was it 2009 to really appreciate it properly. And I feel like I'm usually pretty good at contextualizing and appreciating things for what they were, even if I wasn't there originally to play it. But this is one case where I just can't do that. So the appeal of Grand Theft Auto 4 is completely lost on me. I maybe played for an hour, and then that's all I could invest in it. I just didn't get into it at all. Maybe it's also just because I don't think I'm big into either crime or true crime. So those genres tend to be lost on me. I guess most people are really into that kind of stuff. I'm lukewarm at best on those kind of things. I don't know. Anyway, so for me, I'm going to put it in E. And remember, this is my list, so I can do what I want. It's an E. I know nobody else will agree with that, but that's okay because this is America and we got freedom of speech. And you can clearly still play this game even if you think that my opinion of this is totally fucking absurd. Doom 3 BFG Edition. So I got this because I wanted to try Doom 3. I played a little bit of the Xbox port of it, the original Xbox port that is, and once I figured out that I was about to upgrade to the Xbox 360, I decided why not go with the better graphics. That's what I did. Overall, it is a flashlight shooter is what I'd call it. I don't know if anybody else uses that term, but I like to call them flashlight shooters. So kind of games from the mid-2000s liked to put you in the dark. I think it's because of graphical limitations, just like how so many PS1 games used fog all the time. And so you wander around in the dark with your flashlight and you shoot various Doom enemies on Mars. Cool premise. The setup is pretty cool. That being said, I never really got fully into this. I preferred the earlier games a lot more. And I have not played the newer games from 2016 and 2019 enough to know how I feel about those. But I feel like those are an upgrade over this. This to me doesn't really feel like Doom. It feels more like an Alien or Predator game. It's fine, but actually the only reason I'm really glad I got it is because it contains Doom 1 and 2, which are two of my favorite games ever. That being said, now that I have Game Pass, I have Doom 1 and 2 for free on tap. And I also have the expansion pack for the original Xbox. So I have Doom 1 and 2 there as well. I've got Doom 1 and 2 no matter where I want it. So almost any console I plug in right now, I can play Doom 1 or 2. Not that I actually do that all the time, but I could if I wanted to, is the point. Anyway, BFG edition of Doom 3, I'll give it a C. It's decent, but it's not quite what I was looking for. Then there's Rage, which I believe is also an id game. Rage is, I think, late in the life cycle of the 360. I was introduced to it when my sister got her PS3 and she wanted somebody to play with her. And so we played a little bit one summer. I played it again on my own a little bit. I think it's on Game Pass still. It's decent, but I don't really get how it's different than a lot of other games. I guess it's sort of like a more serious version of Borderlands in that you're surrounded by total psychos, but there's not humor. As I guess the best way I could describe it. It's one of those. It's definitely got a difficulty spike. It reminds me a little bit of Destiny in a way. I don't know why, because Destiny is clearly much lighter toned, but Rage, for me, is about a D tier. I've definitely played better games than Rage. I played worse, though. Civil War Nation Divided comes to mind. That game sucks. I was a big fan of the original Quake games, especially Quake 3. I used to have Quake 3 on PS2, and although I know that was not the best version of that game, I still enjoyed it. I had it on PC as well for a while, and that version was better. And later on, I even got it for Dreamcast, but I didn't have the mouse and keyboard, so if you have the Dreamcast controller playing Quake 3, oh my fuck, that is a miserable experience. Anyway, the point is I like Quake as a series, especially the third game. I played a little bit of 1 and 2. Those are both on Game Pass now, so I can play those anytime I want. So I decided to go back and play Quake 4, and there's also Quake Enemy Territories, which I haven't played as much. But Quake 4 is more of like a Doom 3 style game, in the sense that you've got a squad. It's supposed to be more like a sci-fi shooter, where you go off on your own sometimes. This one is pretty early in the PlayStation and the Xbox 360's lifestyle, so it's technically a lot less impressive than, say, Doom 3, even though Doom 3 is actually an older game, but it was just like built for high-end PCs at the time. Quake 4, excuse me, it's okay, but again, it was a little dated by the time it came out, at least it seemed that way. Certainly, it was not on par with something that would be nearly contemporaneous, like, say, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the original one from 2007. So by the time that came out, Quake 4 felt really creaky. So for me, it's a victim of other games being better. I would put Quake 4 in the E tier. It wasn't really worthy of the name. It's too much of a deviation. It's too generic. And it was outdated within about a year of coming out. Speaking of games that did themselves no favors, let's talk about Operation Flashpoint. It was called Rising Dragon or something like that. This is a game where the U.S. and its allies are fighting China. Okay, promising start. A good pure power war in the modern era. So you can make a good shooter out of that, surely. Except you can't, because this game is miserable. The controls in this are abysmal. I don't know how to get around here accurately. I'm not even sure if it's possible to crouch in this game. Navigation's a chore. Most of the time you get killed from beyond visual range, which I guess is realistic, but that makes for really piss-poor gaming if you just die for no reason from a sniper or whatever, and there's no way to approach something except to very slowly try to move through the open, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what this game expects, but this is a mess of a game. It should have never been released. It is, in its own way, about as bad as Civil War: A Nation Divided. In fact, I would say it might be worse. I'll put it in the F tier where it belongs. At least Civil War just tried to do something a little different. Flashpoint, this is just trash. So I would actually prefer playing Civil War. So yeah, this is the worst of the worst tier. Next up we have Chrome Hounds, which is a kind of mech combat game from early in the Xbox 360's life cycle, I should say. I remember finding this and I thought I would give it a try, and much like with Alpha Protocol, my only reason for thinking it might be good is because it said Sega. So like I said, I am a professed Sega fanboy. For the time, this game wasn't bad. So this is an early Xbox 360 game. The graphics are fairly decent. Control is decent. There's a little bit of a story. The main problem is just that you have to spend a lot of time doing transit from area to area. So it's a lot worse paced than something like, say, Mech Assault for the original Xbox. So you spend a lot of time just getting from place to place, which is kind of annoying. It's a decent game otherwise. There's not much to say. I'd give it a D. I didn't really enjoy it that much, but it isn't that bad. And had I gotten it back in 2006, I would have probably enjoyed it more but at that point, it would have still been much more on par with things like Mech Assault and Armored Core series and things like that. But as things stand, there's not really a compelling reason to play it. And then we get to two of the other great classics of this era, Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. So Fallout 3 is set in the DC wasteland. This was the first Fallout game I played, and I waited until I had my Xbox One before I even started this. So once I had access to things like Fallout 4, I wanted to then go back and play the old ones, because what I'd heard is that if you played the newer ones, the old ones feel unplayable. So I wanted to play that while I had the chance. My initial impression of Fallout 3 was actually very negative, and that's because I didn't have my TV set right. So I had to really adjust the settings on my TV to get the lighting up. Otherwise, this game played way too dark, and once I got outside of the vault, I literally couldn't see anything. So once I made a bunch of in-game adjustments and also some physical adjustments, I was able to see, and then I had a fantastic time. So Fallout 3, you come out of the vault, you're like a fish out of water, and you explore this DC wasteland looking for your dad. You have all kinds of moral choices to make. Mechanically, the game can be a little rough at times, but because of how much stuff is here, I'm willing to overlook that. Combat can also be a bit rough, but again, I'm willing to overlook that. I enjoyed most of the characters, most of the scenarios, the world building, all that. For me, Fallout 3 is still a great game. I still put it in S tier. I do understand some people who have trouble playing it now. Like I've convinced other people to try it, but none of them have stuck with it. And I think it's just because it does show its age. This is a game that actually would be a great candidate for a remaster. It's got a lot going for it. A lot of good DLC as well. Although that alien abduction one fucking blows. So I regret heavily making a save on that. That destroyed my ability to go back and play the other ones, because I cannot get through that alien abduction bullshit. But otherwise, everything else in this game, very well done. And I'm very pleased with it overall. We get to Fallout New Vegas. This is the one that I think most people would consider to be the best of the series overall and the best of this era. It mechanically is identical to 3. The big improvement graphically is that not everything is green anymore. So originally, like I said, a lot of these early games would use green to excess, and the Fallout 3 developers from the Bethesda decided to go way in on that because they were trying to make it look radioactive. Although I'm pretty sure actual radioactivity doesn't have a color, but let's not worry about that. Anyway, Fallout New Vegas is set out in the desert near Las Vegas and the surrounding areas. So the setting is different. They also have pretty accurate representations of things like the Hoover Dam. You got different factions, including Caesar's Legion. So the Brotherhood of Steel aren't there really, but Caesar's Legion is. You got the California New Republic or New California Republic, whatever it's called. NCR, so New California. It's an interesting game. Every bit as good as Fallout 3. I know some people say it's better. I actually think it's about the same, just with a few different strengths and weaknesses. I kind of preferred the map on 3 more. I felt like there was more stuff out there. New Vegas probably has, I don't know, they both have great soundtracks, both have the same graphics. I can't choose between them, to be honest. I know most people would side with Fallout New Vegas, but for me it's a straight up draw. I enjoyed both of them. I put about 100 hours into each of them. And so for me, a lot of times I check on how long to beat before I'll play a game. And unless it's something that I know I'll really like, I'm not going to start it unless I'm willing to put in that effort. And so for me, both of these games are absolutely worth that. These are both top tier games. And I do plan on playing the newer Fallouts at some point, 4 and 76. But I've heard some mixed things about them. And so much like with Mass Effect Andromeda, I'm really afraid of being disappointed. But I guess I will eventually have to make that plunge. So we'll see what happens. And I'm sure in the future when I need an easy stream topic to do, I will bring some of these back up as I continue to slowly work my way through a lot of the games that I've not really played properly. Also, speaking of Resident Evil, just real quick, I've actually never played Beyond 6. I need to go back and play 0. I need to play the remaster of the original. I need to play the new 2, 3, and 4. And I need to play the Village and the one before that, where it was like the reboot. So I've still got a lot of Resident Evil to play. I got 2 more Metro games. I have played the newer Halos. I have played the newer Gears of War. I haven't played any other Borderlands yet. Haven't played Dynasty Warriors 8 Empires or 9 yet. So yeah, I got a lot of stuff to do here. And I need to replay all the way through Command & Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3. And I also need to redo the Mass Effect trilogy and play in... Yeah, so I got a lot of shit to do is the point. Not to mention Assassin's Creed, which I've never played. So I got that whole series. Yeah, I think that even if no new games came out ever, I would probably still have enough games to play for the rest of my life. Especially considering how many other things I got going on. So, I am pretty good on games for a long time. Alright, so let's get into the super chats for the evening. First up, we have Jack L for $5. Thank you, Jack. He says the Halo 3 campaign was generally bland, but those multiplayer maps were pretty cool. Many fine memories of playing Snowbound, Guardian, etc. circa 2010. Yeah, my only experience with the multiplayer would be from the Master Chief Collection, and I was never 100% sure which maps were from which game. So, for me, I'm not as aware of which maps were the best. I know I have heard good things about the Halo 3 maps, though. Yeah, I will think about that more. I might eventually go back to Master Chief Collection because I was enjoying those playlists where you can play random levels put together from different games out of order. Just if they have a theme like, aerial assault or whatever. All right. Backdoor Wolf for $4.99. He says his S tier games are Oblivion, which I've never played, Gears 2, hell yeah, Blood Dragon, hell yeah, Rock Band 2 I've never played, but I've heard good things. It looks cool. All the Rock Band games look cool, but I've never played them. I have played Guitar Hero, and I sucked at that. And then Super Meat Boy. I've never played Super Meat Boy, but I know that's available for the newer system, so I might have to check that out. And this is Lance, who I know in real life, actually. And I got one from Arjun Jairpal, or Jairaj, sorry, I wasn't even close. I don't know why I said Jairpal, I guess I'm just sleepy. Arjun Jairaj for $2, thank you, Arjun. And he says, "Oorah, Curio win, please and thank you. Curio soon, thank you very much." But yes, Marcus Scribonius Curio will be one of the is pretty high on my list to be able to cover. I also got Aulus Gabinius coming up, and a few others. Also, the Triumvir Lepidus and his dad are pretty high up on my list too. And I'm trying to think who else is on my immediate list of people to cover. Because I haven't been able to look at that stuff for about 2 weeks now because I've been so busy with the new classes I'm teaching here. Anyway, yeah, I've got a lot of Romans coming up, and I'm also going to do a short series like World History Style on China. So that might come out as early as next week. We'll see what my recording schedule ends up being like. But anyway, thank you all for joining me. Apparently, I'm glad the mic survived the move. It appears everything is set up well. Once I get my main desk, it'll probably be better. And I'm also thinking about doing a mic upgrade. So I've been talking with somebody who is talking about doing some upgrades. So I might have like a better mic at some point. This one I've actually made upgrades to, but apparently it's not really playing out on the air. So that's kind of disappointing. But I guess it is what it is. So yeah, I'm not an audio expert, so yeah. So that is it. I'll see if there are any other sort of fun follow-ups here. Somebody says the Legendary Edition makes ME1 better. Somebody says ME3 has a lot of good stuff. It does, you're right. Somebody says Andromeda sucks. I've heard that from a lot of people. But I've heard the opposite as well. I've heard of From Software. I'm not really 100% familiar. Let's see. Somebody says, what if there's a Gears of War but set in the ancient world? That would be interesting, I guess. Yeah, like a Roman first-person shooter, that could be fun. I do have a Caesar Civil War generals and officers tier list. I need to make one for the second triumvirate period, though. My real name is Thersites the Historian, obviously. It's on the screen. Somebody's a big fan of soccer. I've heard good things about soccer games, you know. I've heard a lot of people are big fans of those. And I've heard good things about the quality, so I don't doubt you there. World War I generals, we still have the Russians and Germans to go, and then the miscellaneous. That one is a slow go for a number of reasons, but it is something I do plan on picking up at some point. I cannot promise a timeline on that. So anyway, I guess that's enough. Oh, how do I feel about Caesar's Legion? It's interesting. I also love the pseudo-intellectual bullshit that Caesar goes into to try to explain thesis and antithesis. Because I love the autodidactic nature of his explanation of Hegel. Because obviously anybody who studied philosophy would know that it's antithesis. And also that that's not really what Hegel said, but let's not worry about that. So anyway, I do love how this guy's kind of a con man, but he's a plausible con man because he grows up in an era where you wouldn't really be able to get a full education. You'd kind of have to interpret these things for yourself. And his interpretation is understandable. So, yeah, I like the way that the Legion forms. And I also love the story of Joshua Graham. You know, the guy who you meet in one of the the DLC. And how he broke away from the Legion. And also, I like the NCR. NCR is a good faction in the sense that they're almost a generic good guy faction in a sense, but also they're not quite boring. It's more like you understand why they make their decisions because they're trying to appease a lot of different interests. So they're, I think, an underrated faction in their own right. So, yeah, and then of course Brotherhood of Steel is pretty light on the ground, but I like Brotherhood of Steel pretty well. Anyhow. So that is it for now. Thank you all for joining. I'm sure I'll be back in the near future. We'll probably get back into more history-specific stuff. I'm not really sure what Sean's schedule's like going forward. And I'm also not really sure who I might have on as a guest going forward either. But I am thinking about trying to expand the guest pool a little bit, trying to expand the number of topics we cover. So we'll see what comes up. Another one I'm thinking of doing in the near future as a solo run will be the Seleucid rulers tier list. So that'll be one that I'll do by myself at some point going forward. I'll also probably have Ben Gerber back at some point to do more medieval monarchs. Yeah, we'll see what happens. But for now, that's all I've got. So thank you all for joining. It's good to be back. Good to be mostly settled in. It'll be better once I got all my books here. Right now, a lot of my books are still in storage, but I will rectify that soon. And yeah, so that's it for now. Have a good night, everybody, and I will plan on seeing you in the near future. Peace out.